Well, hello there. I'm glad you made it back to me tonight, wherever you are right now, whatever kind of day just ended for you. I hope you're finally somewhere soft, somewhere quiet, somewhere you can let your shoulders drop, just for a little while, because tonight we're going somewhere very old and very cold, and if I am honest with you, a little bit haunting. In the autumn of 1562, inside a palace just outside London, a young queen was dying. Her council had already begun quietly asking who would sit on her throne after her. But she did not die that night. What happened instead would shape the way she saw her own face for the rest of her life. And 40 years later, it would end with an inch of white paint covering her skin, hiding a secret almost nobody in her kingdom dared to say out loud. Before we step inside that palace together, can I ask you for something small? If stories like this one feel a little like home to you, it would mean more than, if you tapped that subscribe button, left this video a like, or dropped a comment down below. Just say hello. Tell me where you're tucked in tonight or what time it is on your side of the world. I go through every single one of them, and honestly, that part is my favourite. Now go ahead, dim the lights around you, if you can. Maybe turn on a fan or anything with a soft, steady hum. Get yourself comfortable. Because where we are going tonight is a place most history books tend to walk right past. Alright, let us step inside. Picture Hampton Court Palace on an October evening in 1562. Stone hallways lit by candlelight. Rain tapping softly against old glass windows. Servants moving quietly the way people do in a house where something feels slightly wrong, even before anyone says a word out loud. Somewhere down one of those halls a fire is still burning low in an iron grate, throwing shapes across a stone ceiling that has already watched 3 different kings come and go before her. Inside one of the private chambers, a woman lay in bed, 29 years old, unmarried, only 4 years into the most dangerous job in England, being its queen. Her name, of course, was Elizabeth. It started of all things with a bath. Elizabeth felt a chill coming on that evening, a little tired, a little feverish. So she did the most reasonable thing anyone in 1562 could think of. She decided a hot bath would fix it. It did not fix it. Because this was not a cold. This was smallpox. And in the 16th century, smallpox was not simply an illness. It was one of the most feared words a person could say out loud. A disease that did not care whether you were a farmer, a merchant, or the Queen of England herself. Historians estimate that smallpox killed somewhere around 1 in every 3 people it infected during this period, and left many of the survivors permanently marked by it. There was no vaccine yet, no real understanding of how the disease actually spread, just fear and a slow agonizing wait to see which way the illness would go. Within days, her fever climbed higher than anyone around her wanted to admit. She lost the ability to speak. Her ladies-in-waiting began exchanging looks they thought she could not see. And somewhere past midnight word reached her most trusted adviser, a careful, serious man named William Cecil, that his queen might not survive until morning. He was summoned to the palace immediately, pulled from his bed in the middle of the night, still half-dressed, moving through dark corridors toward the one room in England nobody wanted to enter. Because if Elizabeth died that night, England had no clean answer to the one question that mattered most. Who comes next? There was no husband, no child, no obvious heir that everyone in that palace could agree on without an argument or possibly a small war. And far to the north, in Scotland, another young woman with royal blood and a very different faith was already being whispered about as the answer to that question. We will come back to her. She becomes very important later in this story, but that night, while the Queen of England lay unconscious in candlelight, a very different kind of crisis was unfolding just outside her door. Men in dark robes gathered by firelight quietly arguing about succession, about religion, about the fragile, complicated country she had only just begun to hold together. Word of her illness travelled fast the way frightening news always does. The Spanish ambassador at court, a careful, watchful man named Bishop de Quadra, sat down that same week and wrote a letter to the King of Spain himself describing exactly how the Queen had fallen ill and how grim the outlook seemed. Foreign courts across Europe were quite literally taking notes on whether England was about to lose its ruler. That is how fragile a young unmarried queen's position really was. One bath, one fever, and half of Europe was already reaching for a pen. A German physician named Dr. Bercot was brought in to treat her. His methods were considered harsh, even by the standards of the time, which is really saying something, because 16th century medicine was not exactly famous for its gentle touch. She was given barley water to cool her fever, and a mix of poppy and wild lettuce to help her rest. And then, following one of the strangest medical beliefs of the era, her physicians wrapped her in red fabric, surrounded her with red curtains, red blankets, red anything they could find. The thought, at the time, was that the colour itself might pull the fever out through the skin. There was no real science behind it, but belief back then was often the only medicine available, when you have no microscope, no understanding of viruses, and no real cure sitting on a shelf somewhere. Red blankets start to feel like a perfectly reasonable plan. At one point, Elizabeth stopped speaking entirely for nearly 2 hours. Her ladies feared the worst. Her council feared the worst. Word had already begun slipping out toward foreign courts that the Queen of England might not survive to see the following week. Then quietly she opened her eyes. And the very first thing she asked for was not a physician. It was not her crown, or her council, or any matter of state. She asked that a man named Robert Dudley be named protector of her kingdom, with an income of £20,000 a year, a fortune especially for a man that half her council still watched with quiet suspicion. Robert Dudley was her closest friend and by most accounts the great complicated love of her life. Even half conscious, on what everyone around her believed might be her deathbed, her heart went straight to him before anything else did. Make of that what you will. I certainly have my own opinion. Through all of this, one woman barely left her side. Her name was Mary Sidney. She served in the Queen's Privy Chamber. She was Robert Dudley's own sister, and by every account we have, she was one of Elizabeth's closest and most trusted friends. Night after night, Mary sat beside her queen's bed. She helped change the linen soaked through with fever. She helped cool skin that felt like it was burning from the inside out. She stayed near her at a time when almost everyone else in that palace was terrified to come anywhere near the illness spreading through the Queen's body. Nobody in that room fully understood yet what that closeness was about to cost her. Then, on the 7th night, something shifted. The fever finally broke. Spots began to appear across Elizabeth's skin, which sounds frightening, I know, but was actually, strangely, a good sign. It meant her body was finally pushing the illness outward instead of holding it in. Slowly, painfully slowly, the Queen of England began to come back to herself. By the 25th of October, word reached foreign ambassadors that she was out of bed. Weak, still marked by the illness, but alive. England, for the moment, breathed again. Relief spread so quickly through the court that officials had a commemorative coin struck to mark her recovery. A small piece of silver meant to be held in the hand passed around, kept as proof that the Queen had truly survived. Imagine that. An entire nation frightened enough by 4 days of silence that they needed a physical object just to believe the danger had actually passed. But recovery in this story did not land evenly on everyone. It never quite does. Elizabeth healed. Her face, by most accounts, came through fairly lightly marked for someone who had just survived smallpox. A little roughness in her skin, perhaps. Nothing severe enough to stop foreign ambassadors from still writing home about her beauty. Mary Sidney was not so fortunate. She had caught the illness from nursing her queen day and night, and it left her badly scarred. Her own husband, Henry, had been away serving overseas while all of this happened. He came home expecting to find the wife he'd left behind, Instead, he walked into a room and for a moment did not recognize her at all. He later wrote that he had left behind, in his own words, a full fair lady, and returned to find her changed almost beyond recognition. Try to sit with that for a second. Not a stranger's grief, not a rumour passed down through some old letter. A husband standing in a doorway quietly grieving the face of the woman he still loved, while she stood right there in front of him alive and utterly changed. Loyalty, it turns out, has a face, and Mary's face now carried the cost of somebody else's survival, written permanently into her skin. That night, once the palace had gone quiet again, Elizabeth asked for a small mirror. Not her ladies, not her physicians, just the mirror. She sat by the window where the last of the candlelight could reach the glass, and she looked at her own reflection for a long, long moment. At the faint marks the illness had left along her skin, at the tired eyes staring back at her eyes that had only days earlier gone dark for nearly 2 hours while an entire kingdom waited to see if they would ever open again. Outside, the palace had finally gone still. No more whispering in the halls, no more council members pacing outside her door. Just one young queen alone with a mirror and the quiet, heavy weight of having almost disappeared. And something in her expression changed. She was Queen of England. She had just survived one of the deadliest diseases of her century, and she'd watched a friend pay a price on her behalf that she could never fully repay. Somewhere in that quiet room, looking at her own face by candlelight, 29-year-old Elizabeth made a decision that history would end up remembering far longer than she probably expected it to. She decided that whatever marks the world tried to put on her again, nobody would ever get to see them. Not really, not fully, never again. That decision, made quietly in an empty room with nothing but a candle and a small mirror, would follow her for the rest of her life, and it would grow into something far stranger and far more dangerous than anyone standing in that palace could have guessed that night. A mask made of paint and vanity and a slow, creeping poison she would end up wearing almost every single day for the next 4 decades. And it all traces back to this one quiet, ordinary moment. Not a battle, not a coronation, just a young woman, a candle and a mirror deciding that the world would never again get to see her afraid. But to understand how a small mirror in a quiet room turned into that, we have to go back even further. Back to the frightened, uncertain young woman who became queen in the first place, and the world that taught her, long before any of this happened, that her face was something she could never afford to lose. So let's rewind the clock a little, back past that quiet room with the candle and the mirror, back past the fever and the red blankets, all the way to the very beginning of this story. Because if you want to understand why a few faint marks on her skin could shake a grown queen down to her bones, you first have to understand something most people get wrong about her entire life. Elizabeth was never allowed to simply exist, not for one single day. From the moment she was born, her body, her face, and even her worth as a human being were treated as public property, argued over by men who had never once asked her opinion on the matter. She came into the world on the 7th of September 1533 at Greenwich Palace, the daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. And here is the first uncomfortable little detail almost nobody puts front and centre. Her birth was considered by a fairly large portion of the English court a disappointment. Henry wanted a son. He got a daughter. Some of his advisers reportedly whispered that a girl arriving instead of a boy was a kind of divine punishment for how messy the whole marriage had been in the first place. So before Elizabeth had even opened her eyes for the first time, she'd already failed to meet somebody's expectations. That is quite a way to start a life, wouldn't you say? It got worse before it got better. When Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, her father had her mother executed. Anne Boleyn was accused of crimes that most serious historians today agree were almost certainly fabricated, and she was put to death at the Tower of London. In the aftermath, Henry had his marriage to Anne declared invalid, which meant on paper that his own daughter no longer legally existed as a princess at all. Elizabeth was stripped of her title and quietly pushed to the edges of a household that no longer quite knew what to do with her. Picture that for a moment. A toddler too young to understand any of it, suddenly living in a world where the adults around her had decided overnight that she was something less than what she had been the day before. No one sat her down and explained it kindly. There was no soft version of that story for a child. She simply grew up inside the wreckage of it piece by piece, the way children do, learning the shape of her own danger, long before she had the words to describe it. She would spend years of her childhood being shuffled between houses, governesses and tutors watching the family around her rearrange itself again and again. Her father remarried, and remarried, and remarried again. A younger half-brother was born a boy named Edward, and suddenly there was an heir who actually counted while Elizabeth quietly kept learning her lessons in the background. And here is where I will say something that might surprise you. Elizabeth, by almost every surviving account, was brilliant, truly remarkably brilliant. She was fluent in French and Italian by her teenage years, capable in Latin and Greek, and one of her tutors, a scholar named Roger Ascham, once wrote with obvious pride that her mind and her manner had a certain beauty to them that few young men at court could match. She could write elegant Latin letters, debate theology, and outthink most of the grown men sent to test her. It is worth sitting with that contrast for a second. A girl considered a disappointment at birth and declared legally invisible before she could even talk, grew into one of the sharpest minds in the entire royal household. If that is not a plot twist, I honestly do not know what is. But intelligence on its own does not protect you in a royal family built on suspicion. And Elizabeth's next major test had nothing to do with books. After her father died, her young half-brother Edward briefly held the throne, and when he died as well, only 15 years old, the crown passed to Elizabeth's older half-sister Mary. Mary was devoutly Catholic. Elizabeth had been raised largely within the Reformed Protestant faith. And in Tudor England, that single difference in belief was not a private matter. It was a matter that could get you killed. In the winter of 1554, a rebellion broke out against Mary's rule, led by a nobleman named Thomas Wyatt, partly in protest of Mary's plan to marry the deeply Catholic King Philip of Spain. Elizabeth almost certainly had nothing to do with the plot. But some of the rebels had reached out to her beforehand, hoping to use her name, and that alone was enough. Mary's advisers dragged Elizabeth to court, questioned her for hours, and on the 18th of March that year she was taken to the Tower of London as a prisoner in the very same fortress where her own mother had been executed less than 2 decades earlier. Try for a moment to sit inside that. Walking through gates that had swallowed your mother whole, not knowing if you were about to follow the exact same path. Years later, once she had survived it all and become queen herself, Elizabeth would tell her own parliament something quietly devastating about that period of her life. She said, "I stood in danger of my life, my sister was so incensed against me. No trial ever proved she had done anything wrong. After roughly 2 months, she was quietly moved out of the tower and placed under house arrest at a place called Woodstock, watched constantly by a guard loyal to Mary for nearly a year. She survived by doing something that would define the rest of her life. She said almost nothing that could be used against her. She attended the required Catholic services without complaint. She smiled when she needed to smile and stayed silent when silence was safer. Here is my honest opinion on this part of her story for what it is worth. I think this is the exact moment the real Elizabeth started being built. Not the crown, not the coronation. This. A teenage girl learning under genuine threat of execution that her only real weapon was control. Control over her face, control over her words, control over exactly what the outside world was allowed to see. Keep that thought in your back pocket. It is going to matter again later in this story in a very different context. Mary eventually died in November of 1558, and word reached Elizabeth while she was staying at Hatfield House. She reportedly received the news seated beneath an old oak tree in the grounds, and one of the first things she's said to have uttered was a line borrowed straight from scripture that the moment was the work of a higher hand and marvellous in her own eyes. Within months she was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey in January of 1559. She was 25 years old, and the kingdom she inherited was frankly a bit of a mess. England was religiously split down the middle. It was financially strained after years of expensive wars, and perhaps most urgently of all in the eyes of almost everyone around her, it had a queen with no husband and no obvious heir. This is where I want to pause and actually explain something, because I think it gets skipped over far too quickly in most versions of this story. In 16th century Europe, a queen ruling entirely on her own unmarried was not simply unusual. To a lot of powerful men at the time, it was considered borderline unnatural. Marriage was not viewed as a personal choice for a monarch. It was viewed as a political necessity, almost a duty, the only reliable way to produce an heir, and to lock in a useful alliance with another nation. So from the very first week of her reign, Elizabeth's entire body became a subject of international diplomacy. Foreign courts across Europe began sending ambassadors specifically to observe her, and I do mean observe her closely, and then write detailed reports home describing exactly what she looked like, how she carried herself, whether she seemed healthy, whether she seemed, in their words, marriageable. One Venetian ambassador wrote home describing her as strikingly handsome, with a natural air of majesty in the way she moved and spoke the kind of presence that made it impossible to look at her and doubt even for a second that you were standing in front of a queen. Another foreign envoy, slightly less charmed, described her simply as a very strange sort of woman, clearly unsettled by a young female ruler who refused to behave the way he expected a young female ruler to behave. Sit with that for a second. Before she had signed a single major law, before she had fought a single battle, foreign governments were already building entire political assessments around her face, her posture, and her tone of voice. Can you imagine living like that, knowing that somewhere across the ocean, a king you have never met is reading a stranger's written opinion of your skin, and your smile deciding whether you're worth marrying? And the suitors did come, quite a lot of them actually. King Philip of Spain, the very same man her late sister Mary had been married to, sent an envoy to quietly test the waters about marrying Elizabeth as well. Which, if you think about it for even a moment, is a remarkably strange piece of royal recycling. There was a Swedish King Eric who pursued her for years from a distance, sending letter after letter, and reportedly even making plans at one point to sail to England himself and press his case in person. He never actually made the trip. Elizabeth kept him at arm's length for the better part of a decade, polite enough in her replies to avoid insulting an entire kingdom, vague enough that he kept hoping anyway. If patience were a competitive sport, poor Eric would have taken home a medal for it and still gone home with nothing else to show for the effort. There was an Austrian archduke. Later on, a French duke roughly half her age would court her as well, though that particular chapter of her life comes much further down the road than where we are right now. Here's a little modern comparison just to make this land properly. Imagine your entire dating history being conducted through official government letters written by strangers filed away in royal archives, some of which still survive today for historians to study. No pressure at all. But out of every relationship in her early reign, the one that mattered the most and caused the most damage was not with any foreign prince. It was with a face you already know well from earlier in this story, Robert Dudley. By the spring of 1559, barely a few months into her reign, court, gossip had already noticed how much time Elizabeth and Dudley were spending together. He was charming, athletic, and constantly at her side as her master of the horse. The only real obstacle standing between rumour and disaster was one simple, inconvenient fact. Robert Dudley already had a wife. Her name was Amy Robsart, and she rarely appeared at court, living instead in various homes around the countryside, while her husband spent nearly all of his time near the Queen. Whispers grew louder every year, and then in September of 1560, Amy was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in the house where she was staying. The official explanation at the time pointed to an accident, and modern historians who have studied her final months now believe she was likely already suffering from a serious illness, one that may have made a fall considerably more dangerous than it should have been. But in 1560, nobody outside that household knew any of that. What the public heard was simply this: the Queen's favourite's wife is dead, and the timing is more than a little convenient. For a woman whose reputation was already being measured letter by foreign courts across an entire continent, this scandal was almost catastrophic. It did not matter how innocent Elizabeth actually was. What mattered was how the story looked from a distance, and from a distance it looked terrible. I will give you my honest take here, because I think it is one of the more overlooked truths of her entire reign. A king in Elizabeth's exact position, with the exact same rumours swirling around him, would likely have weathered the scandal within a season, brushed off as the ordinary gossip that follows powerful men everywhere. Elizabeth did not get that privilege. Every rumour about her stuck a little longer, cut a little deeper, because the entire idea of a woman ruling alone was still to a lot of people watching from outside her palace walls something that needed to be justified in the first place. She learned painfully and publicly that she could never again afford even the appearance of losing control of her own image. Not her romantic choices, not her reputation, and as we already saw earlier in this very story, not even her own face. Which brings us to a name I promised I would come back to. Up in Scotland, at almost exactly this same period, another young queen was living a very different kind of life. Her name was Mary, Queen of Scots, and unlike Elizabeth, she had grown up surrounded by glamour, raised at the extravagant French court, already married once to the young French king before she was even out of her teenage years. Two queens, similar in age, cousins by blood, and about as different in temperament and circumstance as two royal women could possibly be. We're going to spend a great deal more time with her later, because her story becomes tangled up with Elizabeth's in ways that are honestly hard to overstate. For now, just remember one simple thing about the contrast between them. Mary had been handed glamour early, almost carelessly, a crown placed on her head before she could even walk on her own. Elizabeth had to build every ounce of her public image herself, brick by brick, scandal by scandal, with absolutely no room for error. Two queens, two completely different childhoods, and as it would turn out, two very different definitions of what it actually cost to wear a crown. Which one of them do you think had the harder road? I have my own answer, but I would honestly love to hear yours in the comments. So by the time we reach October of 1562, the moment where we first met her in this story, Elizabeth was already a woman who had spent her entire life being watched, measured, and judged purely on the basis of her appearance and her behaviour. She'd already survived a childhood built on suspicion, a near execution in her own family's shadow, an international marriage market treating her like a prize horse, and a scandal that could have destroyed her reputation overnight. Now you understand why smallpox was never simply a medical emergency for her. It was a direct physical threat to the one thing she had spent her whole life carefully constructing. And what actually happened to her skin in the weeks after that fever finally broke what the disease actually left behind, and how it quietly began reshaping the way she saw her own reflection for the rest of her life, is exactly where we are headed next. Here's where the story gets a little messier than most people expect, because what actually happened to Elizabeth's skin after that fever broke depends entirely on who you choose to believe. Let's start with the slow, unglamorous truth of just getting better. Smallpox does not simply vanish the moment a fever drops. For days after Elizabeth finally opened her eyes and recognized the faces around her again, her body was still working through the disease covered in raised fluid-filled bumps that eventually crusted over into scabs. It was uncomfortable, it was itchy, and it was by every account we have deeply humbling for a woman who had spent her entire life being watched and judged on her appearance. Her ladies changed her linens quietly each morning, careful not to disturb the healing skin, and kept the shutters half drawn against the daylight, which apparently stung more than anyone had expected. For roughly 2 weeks she stayed almost entirely out of sight, tended only by a small circle of trusted women, while the rest of the court simply waited for news, and if the letters from that autumn are any indication, quietly held its breath. By the 25th of October, a report finally slipped out to foreign courts describing her condition. And here is a detail I find almost more interesting than the illness itself. The ambassador writing home did not describe her spending those mornings catching up on paperwork or meeting with her counsel or doing anything resembling the actual business of ruling England. He described her spending her mornings trying to manage the marks left on her face, doing whatever a 16th century woman could do to keep them from becoming permanent. Think about that priority list for a moment. Weeks after nearly dying, with her entire kingdom on edge, one of the very first things she turned her attention to was her own reflection. Now here comes the part where historians actually start disagreeing with each other, and I think it is worth walking through both sides honestly, rather than just picking the version of the story that sounds better on camera. The popular version, the one that gets repeated in most documentaries and most casual conversations about her, says that Elizabeth came out of that illness badly scarred, and spent the rest of her life piling on thick white makeup, specifically to hide those scars. It is a clean, satisfying story. Wounded queen, permanent damage, lifelong disguise. Simple cause and effect. But a fair number of serious historians who have actually dug through the surviving letters and portraits from this exact period argue something quite different. Several accounts from the weeks after her recovery describe her as coming through the illness with surprisingly little lasting damage to her face. Certainly nothing severe enough to explain on its own the elaborate, almost architectural layer of white paint she would eventually become famous for. Historian Anna Whitelock, whose research into Elizabeth's image has become something of a reference point on this exact question, has argued that the full dramatic version of her signature, look the one people now call the Mask of Youth, was not actually a rushed reaction to scarring in her 20s. It came together as a deliberate, calculated piece of image making much later in her reign, once she was well into her 50s and 60s, trying to project timeless youth rather than simply cover up old wounds. So which version is true, honestly? Probably a little bit of both layered on top of each other over the following 4 decades. And if you ask me, that is actually a far more interesting story than the simple one. Here is how I would put the pieces together. In the immediate weeks after 1562, Elizabeth likely did carry some genuine physical self-consciousness about her skin, even if the damage was relatively minor by the standards of the disease. She had spent her entire life being described, evaluated, and judged by strangers writing letters about her looks to foreign kings, so even a small imperfection would have landed very differently on her than it might have landed on an ordinary young woman with no crown to protect. Vanity is not always about how bad something objectively looks. Sometimes it's entirely about how much you've already been taught that your appearance is the only currency you're allowed to spend. There is also a simpler, more practical explanation sitting underneath all of this one that has nothing to do with vanity at all. A queen without a husband, without an heir, and without a firm grip on the loyalty of a religiously divided country could not afford even the faintest rumour that she was somehow diminished. Whether her actual scarring was severe or barely visible almost did not matter. What mattered was making absolutely certain that no version of the story circulating through foreign courts could be twisted into evidence that England now had a damaged queen sitting on an already shaky throne. Self-consciousness and cold political calculation in her case were never really separate feelings. They fed each other quietly for the rest of her life. It helps to remember, too, just how slowly information actually travelled in 1562. News did not move in seconds the way it does now. It moved by horse, by ship, by whichever traveller happened to be heading in the right direction that week, and every retelling along the way had room to grow, shrink or twist into something a little different from what had actually happened. A queen who was mildly unwell in October could easily become 3 retellings and 2 boarders, later a queen who was disfigured beyond recognition, simply because nobody along that chain had any fast way to check the facts. Elizabeth's council understood that danger perfectly well, which is exactly why controlling the story mattered just as much as controlling her actual face. In a world with no real way to correct a rumour once it started travelling, the safest move was never letting the rumour start in the first place. What she did with that self-consciousness in the short term was fairly ordinary for a noblewoman of her era. Court ladies at the time already used simple preparations on their skin long before Elizabeth ever caught smallpox things like whitened pastes made from egg whites and alum-light dustings of powder to even out complexion, the 16th century equivalent of what we would now casually call foundation. These were common, unremarkable tools already sitting in most noblewomen's dressing chambers. There is nothing dramatic about a young queen reaching for a jar that half the women around her already used. The dramatic part, the truly toxic part of this story comes later, and comes from a very different direction than most people assume. We will get to exactly how that happened, and exactly what was actually in that jar very soon. But it is important to understand that in the autumn of 1562, Elizabeth was not yet the ghostly white icon most people picture when they hear her name. She was simply a young, frightened, careful woman, quietly reaching for the same ordinary tools any woman of her class might have reached for while trying to hold together a public image that had already survived far too many narrow escapes to risk losing now. What actually did change immediately and permanently was not her makeup routine. It was her relationship with being seen at all. Before 1562, Elizabeth had been famously accessible for a monarch walking among crowds, allowing ambassadors and visiting nobles to study her from just a few steps away, using her own visible presence as one of her sharpest political tools. After the illness, something in that openness quietly tightened. She began limiting exactly who was allowed near her in low light or bright daylight, favouring dimmer rooms and carefully angled seating for important audiences. Portrait painters of the period were expected as a rule to flatter their royal subjects rather than capture them with documentary accuracy. But Elizabeth, more than most monarchs before her, began paying very careful attention to which images of her were allowed to circulate at all. Can I ask you something here, because I think this next question actually matters more than it sounds like it should. Have you ever noticed how much more careful people become about being photographed after something has gone even slightly wrong with how they look, even something small, even something nobody else really noticed? That instinct is not new. It is not a modern social media era invention. Elizabeth was living out an early high-stakes version of exactly that same instinct 400 and some years before anyone had ever heard the word selfie. We do a quieter version of this ourselves all the time, and most of us never even notice we're doing it. Choosing the one photograph out of 20 to actually send. Turning slightly away from a camera on a tired morning. Waiting for better light before answering a video call you would rather skip entirely. None of that makes anyone vain or dishonest. It makes us human, doing exactly what humans have always done when the world is watching and the stakes feel higher than they probably are. Elizabeth simply lived that same instinct with an entire kingdom and half of Europe watching her every single day. There is a particular kind of quiet cruelty in that if you think about it. A world that had spent her entire life scrutinizing her appearance for political meaning had also in the exact same breath taught her to be terrified of ever letting that appearance slip in public. She did not build her caution out of nowhere. She built it brick by brick out of a life that had never once let her simply exist, without an audience keeping score. Here is something else worth sitting with a thread we will pick back up much further into this story. 1562 was not a single isolated moment of caution. It was the first stitch in a habit that would run all the way through to the final winter of her life decades later. From this point onward, Elizabeth developed a quiet, consistent instinct to hide weakness of any kind from public view. Not only scars, but illness, exhaustion, fear, anything that might make her look less than fully in command. Keep that pattern in mind. It resurfaces in a much darker way near the very end of her reign, and it starts as far as we can tell right here, in the weeks after this one illness. Let me offer you a comparison here because I think it puts her situation into sharper focus. Smallpox scarring in the 16th century was an almost unbelievably common part of daily life. Historians estimate that a significant share of the entire adult population across Europe carried some visible mark from the disease at some point in their lives. For an ordinary merchant or a farmer's wife or even a minor noble, a few pockmarks were simply part of being an adult human being who had survived long enough to grow old. Nobody wrote urgent letters to foreign kings about a baker's complexion, but Elizabeth did not have the luxury of being ordinary. Every mark on her skin was potential material for a rival court to gossip about potential evidence in the endless, exhausting argument over whether a woman was truly fit to rule a kingdom without a husband standing beside her. The same disease that left millions of regular people with a few faint scars and absolutely no political consequences left one very particular young queen convinced that she now had to manage every square inch of her own face like a diplomatic negotiation. And it is worth noticing who did not have to carry that same weight. Plenty of kings across Europe in this exact period lived out their entire reigns with visible pockmarks, weathered skin, missing teeth, and nobody wrote anxious letters home questioning whether they were fit to hold a sceptre. A scarred king was simply a king who had survived something. A scarred queen, especially an unmarried one with no husband to share the burden of legitimacy, was treated as a walking question mark. The disease did not choose who it marked more harshly. The world around her did that part entirely on its own. That to me might be the real lesson tucked inside this entire chapter of her story, long before we even get to the poison. It was never really about vanity in the shallow sense people usually mean when they use that word. It was about a woman who had been taught over and over again from childhood, all the way through a plague that nearly killed her, that her physical body was never fully her own. It belonged to the crown. It belonged to foreign ambassadors filing reports. It belonged to a kingdom that needed her to look at every single moment like proof that everything was fine. If there is a mistake worth naming here, I think it is the mistake most of us make when we tell this story too quickly. We reach straight for the easy version. Scarred queen, hidden face, tragic vanity. It fits neatly into a single sentence and it feels satisfying to say out loud. But the real version is slower, sadder, and honestly a bit more human than that. A woman was taught her whole life that her face belonged to everyone except herself, survived an illness that could have taken it away completely, and came out the other side simply doubling down on the only defense she'd ever been given. Control what people see, control it early, control it always. And here is where her story quietly connects in a strange way to almost anyone listening to me right now, wherever you happen to be tucked in tonight. Most of us will never rule a kingdom. Most of us will never have foreign ambassadors writing letters about our complexion. But nearly all of us know exactly what it feels like to smooth something over before letting the world look at us, to choose the better angle, the softer light, the moment right before we are ready to be seen. Elizabeth simply lived that instinct at the highest possible stakes centuries before any of us had a name for it. So no, the smallpox itself did not hand her a jar of poison overnight. That part of the story still needs its own careful telling, and I promise we're getting there. What the illness actually handed her was something quieter, and in its own way more permanent. A lesson learned in her own body that safety meant control, and control meant never again being caught unprepared in front of the world. And it was exactly that lesson sitting quietly in the back of a careful young queen's mind that would eventually steer her toward a very particular product, being perfected at that very same time far across the sea, in the workshops and trading houses of Venice. A product with a name that sounded almost elegant, almost harmless, and turned out to be neither one of those things at all. Let's finally give this thing its proper name, because up until now I have been circling around it on purpose. Venetian ceruse, Cerussa Venetia if you want the older, fancier version of the label. And before we get anywhere near Elizabeth's dressing table, I want to take you somewhere you probably were not expecting. Not London, not even Venice at first. We're going all the way back to ancient Rome, and even further than that, because this particular poison has a family tree that stretches back thousands of years before anyone ever painted it onto a queen's cheekbones. Here is the part that truly surprised me when I first started digging into this. Humanity did not accidentally stumble into using this substance. People knew it was dangerous almost from the very beginning, and used it anyway for well over 1,000 years, purely because it worked so well at making skin look pale, smooth, and expensive. That single fact tells you almost everything you need to know about how far people will go for beauty, long before Venice or Elizabeth ever entered the picture. The core ingredient here is a soft, heavy metal called lead. On its own, that metal is a dull, grey, unglamorous material, the kind of thing you would use for pipes or weights, not something you would ever picture on a noblewoman's face. But when this metal sits exposed to vinegar fumes over a long period of time, something strange happens to it. Its surface slowly corrodes into a fine, brilliant white crust. Scrape that crust off, grind it into powder, and you get a pigment so smooth and so opaque that for well over 1,000 years it was considered one of the most desirable whitening substances a human being could put on their skin. The ancient Egyptians were already using lead-based compounds in their eye makeup, thousands of years before Rome even existed, grinding a related mineral called galena into the dark coal still associated with ancient Egyptian portraiture today. The Greeks had their own version of this same white powder, which they called Cimethian, and in Rome wealthy women applied a very similar preparation called cerussa to achieve that same pale aristocratic glow that so many cultures across so many centuries seem to associate with wealth, leisure, and status. It is worth pausing here to notice just how consistent this particular obsession has been across human history. Different continents, different languages, different centuries, and yet the same basic idea keeps resurfacing again and again. Pale skin means you do not work outdoors under a harsh sun. Pale skin means servants, not the woman herself, handle the dirt and the labour. In culture after culture, for reasons that had very little to do with actual beauty, and a great deal to do with class whiteness on the skin, became a kind of quiet, wearable proof that you belonged to a life of comfort. Centuries later, and an entire ocean away court women in Japan would reach for their own version of this same idea, a fine white rice powder, rather than lead, chasing an almost identical visual effect for almost identical reasons. Different chemistry, same quiet message written across the skin. Here is a detail I honestly love because it connects back to something we have already talked about in this very story. According to ancient sources, the earliest actor credited with introducing the theatrical mask into Greek drama, a performer named Thespis, is said to have first whitened his own face using this exact same white lead powder, long before masks made of wood or fabric ever entered the picture. Which means, in a strange, almost poetic way, the very first mask in the history of Western theatre and the mask Elizabeth would eventually wear on her own face were built from the same toxic material separated by roughly 2,000 years, and one very unlucky coincidence. Now you might assume that ancient people simply had no idea lead was dangerous. That would be a reasonable guess. It would also be completely wrong. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, describing this exact substance in his enormous encyclopedia of the natural world, flatly called the white lead used in Roman cosmetics a deadly poison. Not a mild irritant, not a minor inconvenience, a deadly poison in his own words written down for future generations to study nearly 2,000 years before Elizabeth was even born. The Roman architect Vitruvius separately observed that labourers who worked with this metal on a daily basis tended to develop a pale, sickly look themselves, quite different from the fashionable glow their product was meant to create for wealthy customers. And centuries before either of them, the physician Hippocrates had already linked a severe, agonizing form of stomach colic in metal workers directly to their exposure to it, making it one of the very first documented occupational illnesses in recorded human history. So let's be honest about what this means. This was not some mysterious, unknowable danger that caught the ancient world completely off guard. People wrote it down. People warned about it in surviving texts we can still study today, and people kept manufacturing it and selling it anyway because the demand for pale, flawless skin consistently outweighed the documented risk of slow poisoning. Part of what makes this even stranger is how much of that ancient warning quietly got lost along the way. Pliny's writing did survive, copied by hand across centuries by monks and scholars, but the world that eventually rebuilt this industry in Renaissance Italy was not exactly organized around careful medical literature reviews. Knowledge before the printing press made copies cheap and plentiful, moved slowly, unevenly, and often only reached the people with the time and the education to go looking for it. A busy merchant manufacturing cosmetics for profit, and a queen simply reaching for a jar her ladies had already prepared for her, were not exactly first in line to sit down and study a 2,000-year-old warning written in Latin. The information existed. Whether it reached the people who actually needed to hear it is an entirely different question. Does that sound familiar to anyone besides me? Because if you swap out a few nouns and update the packaging, that exact pattern has repeated itself more times across history than most of us would probably feel comfortable admitting. Even now, in an age of ingredient labels and government regulators, products occasionally get pulled from shelves years after health agencies quietly knew something was wrong with them. Knowing a danger and acting on that knowledge, it turns out have never been quite the same thing in any century. For centuries after Rome fell, the production of this white lead pigment did not disappear. It simply shifted focus. Medieval European workshops kept manufacturing it mostly now for use in paintings and illuminated manuscripts rather than cosmetics, since its brilliant opaque whiteness made it enormously valuable to artists as well as to vain aristocrats. By around the 13th century, craftsmen across Italy had refined and standardized a production method that came to be known as the stack process, a method that would go on to dominate white lead manufacturing in Europe for the next several hundred years with barely any meaningful changes. Here is roughly how it worked, and I promise it is stranger than you are picturing right now. Workers would take thin coils or sheets of lead and place them inside earthenware pots alongside a small amount of vinegar, careful to keep the metal from actually touching the liquid directly. These pots were then stacked sometimes by the hundreds inside specially built sheds and packed tightly around and beneath, with fresh animal manure or occasionally spent bark left over from tanning leather. As that organic material naturally fermented and broke down, it generated both heat and carbon dioxide, while the vinegar below released a steady stream of acidic fumes rising up around the metal. Over the course of several weeks, sometimes nearly a full month, that combination of heat, acid, vapor, and gas slowly corroded the outer surface of the metal into a soft, brilliant white crust. Workers would eventually break open the stack, scrape that white layer away from what remained of the coils, wash it, and grind it down into the fine, silky powder that merchants would then package, price, and sell across the continent. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because there is something almost unbelievably grim buried inside of it. An entire industry built quite literally on rotting manure corroding metal, and weeks of toxic fumes trapped inside sealed sheds existed purely to produce a powder that wealthy women would eventually dust across their faces in pursuit of looking clean, pale, and untouched by the ordinary world. Picture the smell alone, thick and sour and animal, clinging to the workers' clothes long after they left the shed for the night, an odour that had absolutely nothing in common with the delicate, refined image the finished powder was eventually sold under. The people producing this substance almost certainly paid a heavier price than the people ultimately wearing it. Labourers working inside those sheds, breathing in fumes day after day, week after week, would have absorbed a far greater dose of lead than any single application ever applied to Elizabeth's skin. Their names rarely survive in the historical record. Their symptoms, tremors, stomach, agony, mental confusion. The same set of horrors we will spend real time unpacking. Later in this story, mostly went unrecorded, dismissed as the ordinary cost of working a difficult trade. The beauty industry, even in the 16th century, had a supply chain, and the people standing at the bottom of that supply chain almost never got their names written into the same glamorous portraits their labour eventually helped create. Somewhere centuries ago, there was a man whose hand shook every evening after his shift ended, whose stomach ached in ways no physician of the time could properly explain, and whose entire contribution to history amounts to a handful of surviving guild records listing his trade, not even his full name in most cases. He never met the queen whose face his work would eventually help paint. He almost certainly never once imagined that anyone centuries later would sit quietly at night and think about him at all. I think he deserves at least one sentence in this story. Consider that sentence delivered. That to me is a piece of this story that deserves far more attention than it usually gets. We tend to focus entirely on the queen wearing the mask. We rarely stop to think about the anonymous workers who spent their lives producing it. So now the question worth asking is simple. If nearly every major city in Europe had some version of this manufacturing process, why did the specific label Venetian become the one everyone wanted? Part of the answer is pure geography and trade. By the 1500s, Venice sat at the centre of an enormous trading network stretching from northern Europe all the way to the eastern Mediterranean, moving spices, silk glass and luxury goods of every imaginable kind through its harbour. A city already famous across the continent for producing the finest glass in the known world on the island of Murano, and for exporting perfumes, dyes and refined goods to royal courts, everywhere had both the chemical expertise and the marketing instincts to turn an old common product into something that felt truly elite. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Have you ever paid more for something purely because of where it was made, even when you could not fully explain why that origin mattered so much? That instinct is not new either, and Venice back in the 1500s understood it just as well as any modern advertising executive does today. Think of it almost like a modern luxury label. Champagne only truly counts as champagne if it comes from one specific region of France. Certain watches only carry their premium reputation because they are made in one particular part of Switzerland. Venice, in exactly this same way, managed to take an ancient, widely available cosmetic and rebrand it as something rarer, purer, and more desirable simply by attaching its own name to the finished product. Whether the Venetian version was meaningfully purer than versions produced elsewhere in Europe is still debated by historians today. What is not really up for debate is how successful that branding turned out to be. Within a few decades, if a noblewoman anywhere from Paris to London wanted the very best whitening cosmetic money could buy, the word Venetian, sitting on the label was doing a tremendous amount of quiet, persuasive work all on its own. And that finally is the version of this product that eventually made its way across the sea to England, packed carefully into merchant ships, alongside silks and spices carried into noble households as a mark of sophistication and wealth long before it ever touched Elizabeth's own skin. It is worth pausing on exactly who could afford any of this in the first place. The finest, purest grade of this whitening powder, the version actually worth calling Venetian, did not come cheap. Importing it across the continent, paying for the reputation stitched into that single word on the label, meant this was never a product sitting on a shelf for an ordinary household to casually pick up. It belonged almost entirely to the aristocracy, to court ladies, to anyone wealthy enough to treat their own face as a small ongoing investment in status. Meanwhile, cheaper, cruder versions of the same basic recipe, often made locally with far less care, and if anything, an even higher concentration of the metal itself, circulated among women who could not afford the imported original, but still wanted some version of that same pale ideal. In a strange, uncomfortable way, being unable to afford the expensive poison sometimes meant ending up with an even more dangerous one instead. By the time it reached her private chambers, this substance had already survived several thousand years of continuous use, a small mountain of ancient warnings written by people who clearly understood exactly what it was capable of doing to a human body, and an entire supply chain built on the quiet suffering of workers nobody bothered to remember. It arrived on English soil with a beautiful name, a reputation for purity, and absolutely none of that history printed anywhere on the label. What happened next inside Elizabeth's own household turned this ancient, well-travelled poison into something even more elaborate. A daily ritual, a performance almost carried out behind closed doors by a small circle of trusted women who understood better than almost anyone else at court exactly how much work it actually took to build a face that was allowed to greet an entire kingdom every single morning. There were mixing bowls and timing, and a very particular order in which everything had to happen, none of it left to chance, and all of it about to become far stranger than a simple jar of white powder could ever suggest on its own. Picture the room before anyone else in the palace is even properly awake. Thin grey light coming through heavy curtains, a basin of water already warmed, small clay pots and glass vials lined up along a table in an order that clearly matters, because every woman in that room already knows exactly which one comes first and exactly which one comes last. A fire crackles low in the corner, more for warmth against the morning chill than for any real light. nobody speaks much above a whisper. This is not a chat between friends getting ready for the day. This is closer to a small, quiet ceremony, performed the same careful way almost every single morning by women who understood that a mistake here would not simply ruin a look. It could start a rumour that travelled all the way to Spain within the month. Only a small handful of women were ever trusted with this task, the same faces returning morning after morning, year after year. Being allowed into that room was not just a job, it was one of the clearest possible signs of how much the Queen actually trusted you, since you were quite literally one of the only people in the entire kingdom permitted to see her face before the mask went on. This was the ritual that turned a nervous young queen's private insecurity into the single most recognisable face in English history. Let's walk through it properly, because I think the sheer number of steps involved truly surprises most people the first time they hear it laid out in full. The base layer came first, and it came in generous amounts. That white lead and vinegar mixture we spent so much time tracing back to Venice was worked into a paste, then applied not only across the face but down the neck, and across the upper chest as well, anywhere skin might be visible above the neckline of a formal gown. Ladies in waiting use soft cloths or small brushes to build it up in careful, even layers, smoothing it toward the hairline and jaw until any hint of natural skin tone had completely disappeared beneath it. This was not some fringe habit practiced by a handful of eccentric court ladies either. The earliest known written record of this exact kind of skin-whitening recipe, appearing in England, dates back to a book published in the year 1519, decades before Elizabeth was even born, describing pastes built from alum tin ash and various white materials mixed with egg white. By the time Elizabeth sat down each morning for her own version of this ritual, the practice already had roughly 40 years of English fashion history quietly behind it. She did not invent this obsession. She simply became by far its most famous and most closely watched practitioner. Once that base had set, it needed one more finishing touch to look properly fashionable, and this next part tends to surprise people every time I mention it. Ladies would take raw uncooked egg white and smooth it directly over the dried lead paste, creating a thin, glossy glaze across the whole face. The effect was almost architectural, a smooth, faintly shining surface that contemporaries actually compared to marble or porcelain. Some particularly devoted followers of fashion went one step further, painting thin, pale blue lines directly onto that glazed white surface to imitate delicate veins beneath translucent skin, chasing an illusion of skin so fine and so aristocratic that you could supposedly see straight through it. Can we just sit with that for 1 second? An entire class of Renaissance women were essentially engineering the appearance of glass skin with egg whites and lead paste and hand-painted veins roughly 400 years before anyone coined the term glass skin as a modern skincare trend. Some ideas apparently never really go out of style, they simply change ingredients. While the face was drying, attention moved to the eyebrows, and this is where things get frankly a little bit dramatic. Fashion at court called for extremely thin, high, sharply arched brows, paired with a tall, open forehead. To achieve that look, women plucked their eyebrows into narrow arcs, and then kept plucking back along the hairline itself, sometimes an entire inch or more, deliberately pushing their own hairline backward to make the forehead appear larger and more elegant. A small number of particularly committed fashionable women reportedly shaved their eyebrows away completely and replaced them with false ones made from mouse skin or from carefully arranged human hair. I want you to picture explaining that last detail to somebody today. Excuse me, is that a new brow gel? No, actually, it is a small strip of mouse fur glued above my eye. Thank you for noticing. History is stranger than most of us give it credit for. Next came the eyes, and here the danger quietly escalated even further. A common cosmetic trick of the era involved a few drops of juice pressed from a plant called belladonna, a name that literally translates to beautiful woman in Italian, applied directly into the eyes to make the pupils dilate. Wide, dark pupils were considered strikingly attractive, giving the eyes a soft, wide, almost dreamlike quality that painters loved to capture. What most fashionable women using it were far less aware of is that belladonna is more commonly known even today by a much less romantic name: deadly nightshade, the same plant capable of blurring vision, quickening the heartbeat dangerously, and in high enough doses killing the person using it, was being dropped directly into the eyes purely in pursuit of a fashionable stare. Kohl made from powdered antimony was then used to line the eyes themselves, deepening their shape against all that pale, glazed white skin surrounding them, and quietly adding yet another toxic metal to a face that already had more than enough to worry about. Have you noticed a pattern forming yet? Because we have not even reached the cheeks or the lips, and the ingredient list has already included one heavy metal and one plant that modern doctors would immediately classify as a poison. Here is a detail worth pausing on because it says something interesting about class as much as beauty. This entire elaborate ritual was quite specifically a privilege of rank. An ordinary woman walking through the street wearing visible, obvious paint on her face risked being judged harshly by her own neighbours, sometimes assumed to be a woman of loose morals, rather than simply someone fond of cosmetics. But a queen or a noble woman surrounded by the trappings of wealth and title could wear an almost theatrical amount of the exact same paint and have it interpreted instead as elegance, refinement, and proof of her station. The very same white face that marked one woman as respectable marked another as scandalous, depending entirely on which side of the social ladder she happened to be standing on that morning. For colour on the cheeks and lips, the most fashionable option at English court was a pigment called vermilion, made from a compound called mercuric sulfide, essentially mercury bound up with sulphur into a brilliant vivid red. It was applied in a neat circular patch high on each cheek, and painted across the lips for a bold dramatic mouth that stood out sharply against all that surrounding white. Women who wanted a cheaper, slightly less toxic option could instead crush up small dried beetles related to the cochineal insect, extracting a natural red dye that plenty of noble women honestly preferred, either for cost for comfort or presumably for the simple reassurance of not painting actual mercury directly onto their mouths every single morning. So let's tally the full ritual honestly, because I think saying it all out loud in one place lands very differently than hearing about it piece by piece. A face and neck fully coated in lead, a glossy shell of dried egg white sealed over the top, eyebrows and an entire hairline deliberately plucked back to reshape the whole forehead. Deadly nightshade dripped directly into the eyes, and mercury painted quite literally onto the mouth. All of that assembled every single morning by hand before a queen was considered properly dressed enough to greet her own council. There was actually one more layer to all of this that had nothing to do with the face at all. Elizabeth's own natural hair happened to be a striking coppery red, and that particular shade quickly became the fashionable ideal across the entire court, the way a monarch's features so often do. Women without that same natural colouring turned to home recipes built from saffron cumin seed and a yellow flowering plant called celandine steeped into oils and rubbed through the hair for hours at a time, chasing that same golden red glow. It rarely worked as well as the real thing, but it certainly kept a great many ladies at court smelling faintly of spice and staining their pillows a suspicious shade of yellow. Here's a question worth sitting with. If you had to guess, how long do you think all of that actually took to apply from the very first layer to the very last touch of colour? Take a second and actually guess a number before I tell you. Contemporary accounts suggest the full process could easily stretch across several hours, particularly for a queen whose face needed to be flawless before any important audience, any portrait sitting, or any visit from a foreign ambassador who would go home and write a detailed letter about exactly how she looked. Multiple women worked on her at once, each one responsible for a different stage. The base coat, the glaze, the eyes, the colour, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had clearly done this exact routine hundreds of times before, almost the way a modern production crew moves around a single actor before the cameras start rolling. Now here comes the detail that tends to truly shock people the very first time they hear it, so brace yourself a little. Given how long the full process took to apply, removing it every single day simply was not considered practical. Instead, many fashionable women, and by most accounts, Elizabeth herself in later years, kept the base layer of lead and egg white, sitting on their skin for roughly a week at a time, only patching over any cracks or smudges that appeared day by day, rather than washing the whole face clean and starting over from nothing. When the layer eventually did come off, it was typically removed using a mixture of lemon juice, rose water, or a paste made from crushed eggshells, honey, alum, and almost unbelievably mercury. Sit with that irony for a moment, because it is a truly brutal one. The very cleansing routine meant to repair the skin damage caused by one toxic metal involved deliberately rubbing a second toxic metal directly onto the same already damaged skin. Contemporary observers noticed the results. One commentator from the period described the skin beneath all of this treatment as turning grey and shriveled over time, which in an almost unbearably cruel twist simply meant applying an even thicker layer of white lead the next morning to hide the damage the lead itself had already caused the week before. That right there might be the single most important pattern in this entire episode, so let me say it plainly. This was not one bad decision. It was a closed loop. The poison caused the damage demanded more of the same poison to conceal it, and the concealment demanded an even harsher cleansing routine which caused further damage, which then demanded an even thicker layer the following week. Around and around for years without anyone involved fully understanding. They were trapped inside a cycle that could only ever get worse. Ask yourself honestly for a moment whether you would have recognized that cycle for what it was if you'd been standing in that room yourself 400 years ago with no laboratory, no toxicology textbook, and every single person around you insisting this was simply what beauty required. It is easy to judge a decision from centuries away with the full benefit of hindsight. It is much harder to imagine spotting the trap while you're still standing inside it. I do want to be fair to the era here, because it would be easy to make this sound like nobody at the time had any concerns at all. That is not quite accurate. Some physicians and writers of the period honestly did push back, recommending gentler alternatives built from alum tin ash or plain talc instead of lead. Their advice existed. It was written down, published, available to anyone curious enough to seek it out. But fashionable society generation after generation kept reaching for the more dramatic, more dazzling, more expensive option anyway. If that sounds familiar, it is probably because we already walked through almost this exact same pattern happening in ancient Rome more than 1,000 years earlier. Warnings existed then too. People used the poison anyway then too. Some habits, it turns out, are simply older and more stubborn than any single monarch, any single century, or any single kingdom. If you want a strange, almost comforting little modern comparison here, think about how many steps go into a fully committed skincare and makeup routine today. Cleanser, toner, serum, moisturizer, primer, foundation, concealer, contour, blush, brow, gel, eyeliner, mascara, lip liner, lipstick, setting spray. 10 steps, sometimes closer to 15, is not remotely unusual for plenty of people getting ready for a big night out right now in this exact year. The instinct to build a face in careful, deliberate layers clearly never disappeared. What changed, thankfully, is what most of those individual layers are actually made of. Modern regulators test ingredients for exactly the kind of slow, cumulative harm that nobody in Elizabeth's privy chamber had any real way to measure or even properly name. Would Elizabeth have recognised any of this? Honestly, probably. The mirror, the layering, the careful order of operations, the small trusted circle helping her get ready. Only the ingredients list would have truly shocked her, mostly because it would have looked so much safer than her own. And that gap between knowing something looks beautiful and understanding exactly what it is quietly doing to the body underneath is precisely where this story turns from strange history into something far more serious. Because everything we just walked through the lead, the Mercury, the belladonna working together every single day for years at a time, was not simply sitting harmlessly on top of Elizabeth's skin. It was working its way steadily into her body in ways 16th century medicine had absolutely no framework for understanding, and in ways that would eventually reshape not just her face, but her hair, her teeth, her nerves, and quite possibly the entire trajectory of her final years on the throne. To really understand what that meant, we need to stop looking at the mirror for a while and start looking underneath the skin entirely at exactly what a heavy metal does to a human body once it slips past the surface and settles in for the long, slow work of taking something away one quiet symptom at a time. Let's clear up something important right away, because almost every version of this story I have come across online gets this part slightly wrong. And I think the truth is actually more interesting than the myth. Most people picture Elizabeth's poisoning happening the simple way. Lead paste sits on her skin, soaks straight through, and slowly seeps into her bloodstream day after day like water through cloth. It is a clean, intuitive image. It is also not quite how any of this actually worked. Unbroken human skin is a surprisingly tough barrier. On its own, it does not let much lead pass directly through it at all. So if the paste itself was not the main entry point, what was? Think back to everything we just walked through. A thick white paste applied across the lips, not just the cheeks reapplied morning after morning, without ever being fully washed away for up to a week at a time. Every meal, every sip of wine, every casual touch of a hand to the mouth or a fingertip brushing crumbs from the corner of the lips. Every single one of those tiny, thoughtless moments became a delivery method, carrying microscopic flecks of white lead directly into the mouth, and from there straight down into the body through the exact same route as food itself. On top of that, the powder used during application, and any dust released while scraping or grinding fresh batches could easily be breathed in as well, settling deep into the lungs where it absorbed into the bloodstream almost as efficiently as if it had been swallowed outright. So the real danger here was never really about skin at all. It was about eating, drinking, and breathing a substance that had no business being anywhere near a human mouth or a human set of lungs hidden inside a beauty routine that nobody in that century had any reason to suspect. There is something almost quietly tragic about how ordinary each individual moment of exposure actually was. Nobody in that chamber ever handed the Queen a cup marked with a warning. Nobody ever announced that breakfast that morning came with an invisible dose of poison mixed in among the bread and the wine. It happened in the gentlest, most unremarkable ways imaginable. A sip here, a bite there, a careless brush of fingers against the mouth while adjusting a headdress, repeated quietly across thousands of ordinary mornings until the total added up to something the body could no longer simply absorb and forget. Once lead actually enters the bloodstream, here is roughly what happens inside the body, in terms simple enough that you do not need a medical degree to follow along. Lead behaves chemically, almost like a con artist. Your body already relies on a mineral called calcium for dozens of essential jobs, building bone-sending nerve signals, keeping muscles firing correctly. Lead is similar enough to calcium on a molecular level that the body frequently mistakes one for the other, letting lead slip into exactly the same biological doors calcium normally uses. Bones in particular absorb lead the way. A sponge absorbs water, storing it for years, sometimes for decades, quietly releasing small amounts back into the bloodstream long after the original exposure is technically stopped. In other words, a single season of exposure does not simply fade away once the exposure ends. The skeleton itself becomes a kind of slow-release container, leaking the same poison back into the body for the rest of a person's life. Here is a detail I find almost unbearably ironic given everything this entire story has been about so far. One of lead's clearest, best documented effects on the human body is interfering directly with the production of healthy red blood cells. In large enough amounts, it causes a specific kind of anemia, leaving a person pale, fatigued, and short of breath, which means the very substance being used to manufacture an artificial fashionable paleness was at the exact same time quietly manufacturing a second entirely real paleness underneath it, born from a damaged, struggling bloodstream rather than any jar of imported Venetian powder. Beauty and illness in this particular case were not opposites. They were often the exact same shade of pale, coming from two completely different directions at once. There is also a small, strange, and truly fascinating clue that toxicologists still look for today in cases of long-term lead exposure. A thin blue-grey line can sometimes appear right along the gum line, where lead reacts with naturally occurring compounds in the mouth. Doctors still refer to it formally by the name of the physician who first documented it in the 1800s, and it remains even now one of the clearest visible fingerprints chronic lead exposure can leave on a human body. Given how thickly Elizabeth's ladies painted colour across her lips and cheeks every morning, it is worth wondering quietly how many subtle warning signs like that one were simply hidden beneath a fresh coat of paint before anyone at court ever had the chance to notice them. Lead also has a long, well-documented history of tormenting the digestive system directly. Physicians for centuries described a specific severe form of stomach cramping associated with chronic exposure, sometimes agonizing enough to leave grown adults doubled over in pain for days at a time, alongside stubborn constipation and a general grinding fatigue that never fully lifted no matter how much rest a person managed to get. If Elizabeth or any of the women helping paint her every morning experienced stretches of unexplained stomach trouble across the decades, nobody around them had any framework for connecting it back to a jar sitting quietly on a dressing table across the room. Beyond the blood, lead has a well-documented habit of quietly interfering with the nervous system as well. Modern medical case studies involving long-term lead exposure, even ones involving something as unrelated as an old bullet fragment left sitting inside somebody's body for over a decade, consistently report the same cluster of symptoms: tremors in the hands, irritability and unpredictable shifts in mood, difficulty concentrating, occasionally in more severe or prolonged cases, genuine confusion or disturbed thinking. None of that requires imagination or dramatic license to describe. It is simply well-established modern toxicology, the same biology playing out whether the lead comes from a 16th century cosmetic jar or a 21st century injury. This is not some rare exotic condition either safely locked away in old medical journals. Public health researchers still study childhood lead exposure from old paint, flaking off the walls of aging houses, and from contaminated drinking water running through outdated pipes, precisely because the same nervous system effects keep showing up generation after generation wherever this particular metal quietly finds its way into a human body. The biology truly has not changed. Only our understanding of it and our regulations around it ever really did. I want to be careful here and fair to the historical record because it would be far too easy to turn this into a tidy, dramatic explanation for absolutely everything that happened later in Elizabeth's life. We honestly do not have a blood test from 1590, and we never will. What we can say honestly is this. The biological mechanism was real well documented and entirely capable of producing exactly the kinds of symptoms that later observers noticed in her without ever understanding why they were seeing them. Whether it explains everything is a fair question historians still argue about. Whether it explains nothing at all seems frankly much harder to believe. Here's a question worth turning over in your own mind for a moment, and there is no single correct answer to it. If you had grown up in a world where every single respected authority around you insisted that a particular jar of white powder was simply what elegant women used with absolutely no science available to suggest, otherwise do you honestly believe you would have questioned it either? It is a strange kind of humility, imagining ourselves stripped of everything we currently know, and it is worth sitting with for longer than a single passing thought. Now let's talk about the second poison quietly riding along on the exact same face. Mercury hiding inside that vivid red vermilion rouge and lip colour plays by a slightly different set of rules than lead does, though the end results were, if anything, even harder on the body. Mercury has a particular fondness for gum tissue and nerve cells. Chronic exposure to it classically produces swollen, bleeding, painful gums teeth that loosen in their sockets an unpleasant metallic taste that never quite goes away, and in more advanced cases tremors and noticeable personality changes. If any of that sounds strangely familiar, it might be because mercury poisoning eventually earned its own nickname in English, borrowed from an entirely different industry. Hat makers centuries later used mercury compounds to treat felt for the fashionable hats of their own era, breathing in mercury vapour for years inside poorly ventilated workshops. They developed such consistent, recognisable symptoms of tremor and confused, erratic behaviour that the phrase mad as a hatter worked its way permanently into the English language well before anyone had ever written a single word about a queen in Wonderland. Elizabeth's ladies were not making hats, obviously, but the underlying poison and a fair number of its effects on the body were not so different. Even the coal lining her eyes was not entirely innocent, since the powdered antimony used to darken it belongs to a family of metals capable of producing its own quiet set of problems, with prolonged heavy exposure from stomach upset to longer-term strain on the liver and kidneys as the body struggled year after year to filter out a substance it was never designed to process in the first place. And we still have not even mentioned the third ingredient sitting in this exact same daily routine. Belladonna dropped into the eyes to widen the pupil's works through an entirely different biological pathway, again blocking a specific set of nerve signals responsible for controlling pupil size, saliva production, digestion, and heart rate. In small, carefully measured amounts that produces exactly the fashionable wide-eyed look everyone was chasing. In slightly larger amounts, it produces blurred vision, a racing heartbeat, an uncomfortably dry mouth, and at high enough doses confusion or worse. It was quite literally a controlled dose of poison applied directly to one of the most sensitive tissues on the entire human body, purely in pursuit of a fashionable stare. So here is the actual honest picture once you put all three of these substances back together on a single human face. Leads slowly building up in the bones and bloodstream, quietly damaging blood cells and nerves over years. mercury working directly on the gums and nervous system through an entirely separate chemical pathway. Belladonna interrupting basic nerve signals every single time it touched the eyes. None of these poisons politely waited their turn. They were all acting on the same body through different systems at the exact same time every single day for years on end. Toxicologists today have a fairly blunt way of describing what happens when several different toxic substances hit a body simultaneously rather than one at a time. The combined burden tends to be considerably worse than any single substance would have caused entirely on its own, since one system straining to cope with lead has far less capacity left over to also cope with mercury, or with a plant alkaloid interfering with its nerves at the exact same moment. The body does not get to deal with these threats one at a time in a tidy, orderly queue. It has to absorb all of it at once with the same limited set of organs, the same limited store of energy, and absolutely no idea that any of it was ever a threat in the first place. Can I ask you something here? Knowing all of that, does it still surprise you that people at the time struggled to connect a slowly declining queen to a jar of white powder, sitting quietly on her dressing table? I understand the instinct to judge that gap in knowledge from where we are standing now. But without a single working microscope capable of showing them what was actually happening inside a human cell, how exactly were they supposed to see any of this coming? Before we move on, I want to correct one particular myth directly, because it gets repeated constantly online, and I truly believe getting the details right matters, especially in a story about a woman who spent her entire life being misrepresented by other people's assumptions. Elizabeth's infamous black teeth, the detail almost everyone brings up first when her name comes up, were not primarily a symptom of lead poisoning at all, contrary to what a lot of casual retelling suggest. A German traveller who observed her late in life specifically attributed the blackened state of her teeth to something else entirely, something almost embarrassingly ordinary. Sugar. Elizabeth had a famously intense sweet tooth, consumed sugary treats constantly by the standards of her era, and reportedly even polished her own teeth using a paste made partly from sugar and honey, which, dentally speaking, is roughly the worst possible idea imaginable. Mercury almost certainly made the surrounding gum damage considerably worse. But the teeth themselves were mostly undone by dessert, not by poison, and I think that detail deserves just as much attention as the more dramatic version most people already believe. If there is one thing worth sitting with as we wrap up this particular chapter of the story, it might be this. Elizabeth spent decades chasing an image of eternal untouched youth, using tools that were at a purely biological level, actively working against exactly that goal every single day, in ways nobody around her had any real way of detecting, until the damage had already accumulated far past the point of quietly reversing. The musk promised timelessness. The chemistry underneath it was quietly doing the opposite the entire time. If that is not one of the more quietly devastating ironies in English history, I am honestly struggling to think of a better one. And here is where the story finally turns outward again, away from bloodstreams and blood cells and back toward the throne itself, because none of what we just walked through stayed hidden by accident. What happened next was far more deliberate than that. Somewhere between the private, unglamorous chemistry we just spent this entire chapter unpacking and the confident, radiant image the rest of the world was actually allowed to see, an entire machine of image-making quietly went to work. Portraits, proclamations, a very particular version of a face approved and repeated for decades, until it stopped looking like a woman at all and started looking quite deliberately like something closer to a legend. Before we go any further, I want to circle back to something small we mentioned earlier in this story, because it turns out to matter a great deal more than it seemed to at the time. Remember that little silver coin struck after Elizabeth survived her illness, the one meant simply to prove to a nervous kingdom that its queen was still alive. It turns out that coin was not just a plain celebratory trinket. Stamped onto its surface was a small, carefully chosen image, a hand reaching down out of a cloud being bitten by a snake that rises up out of flames, a direct visual echo of a story from scripture in which a man survives a venomous bite purely through divine protection. Around the edge ran a short Latin phrase roughly translating to, "If God is with us, who can stand against us?" In other words, the very first object commemorating Elizabeth's recovery already carried a quiet, deliberate message. This queen survives things that should have killed her because a higher power is looking out for her personally. That coin, minted when she was still in her 20s, turned out to be the opening move in what became one of the most sophisticated, longest-running image campaigns in the entire history of the English monarchy. And by the final decade of her reign, that campaign had grown into something far larger, far stranger, and frankly, far more calculated than a simple queen deciding she liked flattering paintings. Let's talk about how a woman's actual aging face slowly disappeared from public record, entirely replaced by something the palace built almost from scratch. There is a specific portrait art historians now refer to by the name of a previous private owner, the Darnley portrait painted somewhere around 1575. Most experts believe this particular painting was actually created while sitting in front of Elizabeth herself, making it one of the very few images of her we can reasonably trust as an honest likeness. And here is the part that truly changes how you look at every other portrait of her that exists. That one face from that one sitting became the template. Artists across the following decades did not paint Elizabeth fresh, working from a living, changing woman in front of them. They copied that exact same youthful face over and over, decade after decade, onto whatever body gown or symbolic backdrop a new commission required. Art historians even gave this recycled, unchanging face its own nickname, the Mask of Youth. Think about that phrase for a second, because it is almost uncomfortably perfect. We've already spent real time in this story talking about the literal physical mask sitting on her actual skin every morning. Now we're talking about a second mask painted onto canvas, instead of a face equally frozen in time, equally determined never to show a single day passing. This was not some casual habit either. It was managed with something approaching bureaucratic seriousness. Starting in 1581, a court painter named George Gower held an official position specifically created to police this exact issue, personally approving nearly every portrait of the Queen produced by any other artist working in England. A separate artist, Nicholas Hilliard, held his own specialised role, crafting her miniatures and jewellery, small, precious, carefully controlled images meant to be gifted to allies and suitors rather than hung on a public wall. Between the two of them, and the network of approved copyists working beneath them, almost nothing bearing Elizabeth's face reached the outside world without first passing through at least one set of trusted official hands. Imagine having an entire government office whose actual job description involved deciding whether a painting of your face was acceptable enough to exist. Even the professional painters of London seemed to understand there was a genuine problem brewing. Years before that official position even existed in 1573, the guild representing the city's painters and stainers petitioned the Crown directly asking for some kind of restraint on the completely uncontrolled flood of amateur, unauthorised images of the Queen being churned out across the country. Their concern was not really about art quality for its own sake. It was about a Queen's face circulating in dozens of competing inconsistent versions, some flattering, some clumsy, some downright unflattering, with absolutely nobody in charge of which version the public actually believed was real. And when approval alone was not enough, the Crown was perfectly willing to escalate. As early as 1563, officials had already drafted an order attempting to ban portraits containing what one document memorably called errors and deformities. That early attempt never actually became law. But by December of 1596, the situation had changed enough that the Privy Council issued a direct order of its own instructing officers to actively search out and destroy portraits of the Queen, considered unseemly images that had reportedly caused her great offence. We are not talking about mean online comments here, obviously, since none of that existed yet. We are talking about government officials acting under royal authority, physically hunting down paintings and burning them. Can we just sit with that for a second? At one point in English history, showing a queen's face with too many visible signs of age was treated less like an artistic disagreement and more like an act of quiet treason. Historians who study this material closely have noticed something else worth mentioning here because it says a lot about exactly how far this campaign eventually reached. No surviving portrait of Elizabeth dated anywhere between that destruction order in 1596 and her death in 1603 shows her looking anywhere near her real age. Not one. For the final years of her life, the only accurate descriptions we actually have of what she truly looked like come from written accounts left behind by visiting ambassadors, not from any painting hanging on any wall. The brush had been fully deliberately retired from telling the truth. We even know of one specific case that proves the point almost perfectly. Around 1590, a skilled miniature painter named Isaac Oliver produced a small portrait that, unlike almost everything else being approved at court, actually showed Elizabeth looking her real age, lined, weathered, unmistakably human. That particular piece was apparently never finished, and for a long time historians simply assumed the Queen herself had taken one look at it and rejected it outright. Whatever actually happened behind closed doors, the honest version of her face went nowhere. It sat unfinished, quietly shelved, while artists working just down the hall kept right on copying that same eternally youthful pattern for another decade. If you're keeping score of common mistakes people make when they retell this story, here is a big one. A lot of casual retellings frame all of this as simple, old-fashioned vanity, an aging woman who simply refused to look at a mirror and see the truth. The actual history is colder and honestly more interesting than that. This was calculated state strategy built around one specific existential fear that had absolutely nothing to do with wrinkles. Elizabeth never named an heir. She refused to consistently for her entire reign, terrified that naming a successor too early would simply give ambitious nobles a second throne to plot around while she was still alive to defend her own. Which meant her council faced a deeply uncomfortable problem. An aging unmarried queen with no confirmed heir was in the political mathematics of the era, basically a walking countdown toward instability. Every year she grew visibly older, without a resolved succession plan, was in a very real sense. Another year closer to potential civil war, foreign invasion, or a scramble among rival claimants that could rip the kingdom apart the moment she finally passed. So her court did something almost ingenious in its desperation. If they could not promise the country a guaranteed settled future after Elizabeth, they would instead sell the fiction that there might never need to be an after Elizabeth at all. An eternal queen does not require a succession plan. She simply requires a very talented painter and a great deal of quiet, coordinated effort behind the scenes. Two portraits from her final years show exactly how far that fiction was pushed. The first, commissioned by a nobleman named Sir Henry Lee for his own estate at Ditchley, shows Elizabeth standing directly on top of a map of England itself, her feet planted somewhere around Oxfordshire. Behind her, dark storm clouds churn violently across the sky. In front of her, sunlight breaks cleanly through. She is not simply standing near good weather. She is the reason the weather changes at all, a living dividing line between chaos and calm painted at a point in her real life when she was creeping towards 60 years old. Latin phrases stitched into the original composition praised her as a ruler who gives without expecting anything back, and who holds the power to punish, but chooses mercy instead, turning a simple portrait into something closer to a small painted sermon on how a perfect monarch was supposed to behave. The second, known today as the rainbow portrait, might be the strangest, most densely symbolic image ever produced of her. Painted when she was somewhere around her late 60s, it shows a woman who looks, if anything, younger than in portraits made decades earlier. Her skin is smooth and unlined. Her hair is impossibly full and golden. She holds a rainbow in one hand beneath a Latin phrase that translates roughly to no rainbow without the sun, a not particularly subtle way of announcing that she herself was the sun the entire kingdom depended on for its light. Her cloak is covered in embroidered eyes and ears, dozens of them scattered across the fabric like an anxious constellation, an unmistakable visual promise that she personally sees and hears absolutely everything happening across her kingdom, right down to whispers in the farthest corner of the smallest county. And curled along one sleeve sits a serpent gripping a heart-shaped jewel gently in its mouth, an old symbolic shorthand for wisdom holding raw emotion carefully in check. Every inch of that painting is doing political work. Nothing about it is decoration for its own sake. None of that imagery happened by accident. Every single detail was chosen, negotiated and approved, likely by committee, long before a single brushstroke ever touched the canvas. And this campaign did not stay confined to paint either. Around this same period, a poet named Edmund Spenser began publishing an enormous, sprawling epic poem explicitly built around an eternal, virtuous, almost divine fictional queen he named Gloriana, a thinly veiled literary version of Elizabeth herself, stretching her mythology out across pages instead of canvas. Other court poets reached even further back for material, quietly comparing her to Diana, the ancient moon goddess famous for her eternal virginity, or to Astrea, a figure from classical mythology associated with justice and a long-lost golden age. None of these comparisons were casual compliments tossed around at a party. Poets, painters, and playwrights across her court were all quietly pulling from the same coordinated well of imagery, an entire cultural apparatus working in near-perfect agreement to answer one single question. What do you call a ruler who is somehow both a real living woman and, at the exact same time, something considerably closer to a myth? Between the paintings and the poetry, an ordinary aging mortal woman was being steadily, deliberately replaced by something considerably closer to folklore. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If your own government spent years quietly building an entire alternate version of your face and calling it the only acceptable truth, do you think you would eventually start to believe it yourself, even a little? I honestly do not know the answer for Elizabeth specifically. But it is a strange, unsettling thing to sit with regardless. This particular playbook, by the way, absolutely did not end with her. Decades later, across the water in France, a young king would build an entire palace, an entire court calendar, and an entire visual mythology around presenting himself as the literal sun that all of French society orbited, right down to the nickname history still uses for him today. Louis XIV never met Elizabeth, obviously separated from her by roughly a century, and he had his own painters, his own approved portrait patterns, and an entire court built around the daily ritual of simply watching him exist. But the underlying strategy an aging mortal ruler transformed into something closer to a permanent unblinking symbol was practically identical. Some political instincts, it turns out, do not need to be taught directly from one court to another. They simply get reinvented again and again by anyone facing the exact same problem. How do you convince an entire nation that the person in charge will somehow never actually grow old, get sick, or die? Here is the part of this story I personally find the most quietly devastating, now that we have walked through both halves of it side by side. While one team of people were literally applying toxic paste to her real deteriorating skin every single morning, an entirely different team of people were simultaneously painting over that exact same damage in oil and canvas, freezing her at an age she had not actually been in years. The poison was doing its slow, invisible work in one room. The propaganda was erasing every visible trace of that work in another. Somewhere in between those two rooms, the actual human, Elizabeth, the frightened, brilliant, deeply calculating woman we met all the way back at the start of this story, quietly disappeared behind a legend her own government had built specifically to replace her. Doesn't it make you wonder even a little how much of the version of her that survived into our own history books is closer to that legend than to the actual woman who lived and breathed and worried and grew old quietly behind it? I am not sure there is a clean answer to that question. I am not sure there ever will be. She was not the only royal woman of her century desperately managing an image under pressure, though. Far from it. Across the English Channel and beyond, other queens and would-be queens were fighting versions of this exact same battle, sometimes with paint and portraits of their own, sometimes with far stranger methods entirely, and it is worth taking a real look at how their choices compared to hers before we go any further into the final darker chapters of Elizabeth's own story. Let's step outside England for a little while, because I think it helps to see Elizabeth's choices against a wider backdrop before we head into the harder, sadder chapters still waiting for us. Picture a map of Europe in your mind for a second, sometime around the 1570s or 80s. Nearly every royal court on that map was run by people facing some version of the exact same problem Elizabeth faced. How do you look powerful, healthy and worth following in a world with no photography, no video, and absolutely no way to separate your actual body from the rumours constantly circulating about it? Different courts answer that question in strikingly different ways, and I think those differences tell us just as much about Elizabeth as anything we have covered about her directly. It is easy sitting here centuries later to imagine the entire continent nodding along to one single, universal beauty standard. The truth turns out to be far messier, and honestly far more interesting than that. Let's start in France with a woman who arrived there as a 14-year-old bride and ended up reshaping an entire country's relationship with beauty. Catherine de' Medici left Florence in 1533 to marry into the French royal family, and she brought considerably more with her than a wedding trousseau. She brought her own personal perfumer, a man most historians know today as René Le Florentin, along with an entire Italian tradition of scented oils, refined cosmetics, and carefully engineered elegance that French court culture, by most contemporary accounts, simply had not developed yet on its own. By some counts, she eventually kept a personal collection, numbering in the hundreds of different scents and preparations, gifting them liberally to visiting dignitaries as a quiet, fragrant display of Florentine sophistication. Among the specific products she introduced was a fine, fragrant powder made from ground iris root used both to perfume fabric and to lighten skin, an alternative whitening method that did not rely on lead at all. Catherine also popularized an accessory that swept across French high society, almost overnight delicately perfumed leather gloves worn by both men and women as a mark of taste and status. the leather itself tanned using processes that left it smelling truly unpleasant. Badly needed the fragrance just to be wearable in polite company, which meant every fashionable hand at the French court was quite literally covered in a product designed specifically to disguise something unpleasant underneath a pleasant surface. If that sounds like it could serve as a tidy metaphor for almost everything else in this episode that thought occurred to me too, here's an interesting wrinkle worth sitting with for a moment. A truly safer option for achieving that same pale, fashionable look was already circulating in European high society during Elizabeth's own lifetime. It did not require heavy metal at all, which means the toxic version everyone associates with this era was never actually the only available choice. It was in Elizabeth's specific case one option, among several, and not necessarily the safest one on the table. Catherine's reputation, though, carried a much darker shadow alongside all that perfume. For centuries, hostile writers of her own era and plenty of storytellers since have painted her as one of history's most calculating poisoners, supposedly capable of ending a rival's life with nothing more than a scented pair of gloves. The most famous version of that story involved a rival queen who died suddenly, not long before a politically important wedding, with rumours quickly circling that Catherine's own perfumer had prepared the fatal gift. Modern historians looking at this story honestly tend to be far more sceptical than the legend allows. The kind of poisoning being described would have required sustained obvious contact through skin in a way that simply does not match how these particular toxins actually work, and the rival in question most likely died from an entirely unrelated illness common to the period. Does that pattern sound at all familiar to you by this point in the story? A powerful woman operating in rooms full of men, deeply uncomfortable with how much authority she actually held, gets quietly rebranded by rumour into something closer to a villain in a fairy tale, while the actual complicated, politically skilled woman underneath that rumour rarely gets the same attention. We watched a smaller version of this exact same pattern play out around Elizabeth and the death of Amy Robsart back earlier in this story. Apparently this was not a uniquely English problem. It was closer to a continent-wide habit, one that seemed to attach itself to almost any woman who held real power for longer than her contemporaries were comfortable with. Different countries, different languages, different courts entirely, and yet the same suspicious story kept getting told about the same kind of woman over and over, as though European society had only one available explanation for female authority it did not fully understand. There is something almost poetic and more than a little unsettling buried in Catherine's specific reputation too. The rumours accused her of using the exact same tools, perfumers' cosmetics, delicate glass bottles, to beautify and to destroy depending entirely on her mood and her enemies' list. Cosmetics and poison in the popular imagination of her era occupied nearly identical cultural territory. Beautiful, expensive, foreign, and just a little bit dangerous if you looked at it the wrong way. We've spent this entire story exploring how one particular beauty ritual turned out to be truly poisonous by accident. France, at almost the exact same moment, was busy imagining its queen as somebody who might be doing exactly that on purpose. Now let's travel south to a court that took an almost completely opposite approach to all of this. Spain under King Philip II built its entire royal aesthetic around restraint rather than dazzling display. Dark, heavy fabrics, severe structured silhouettes including a stiff cone-shaped underskirt, called a farthingale, that forced every gown into the exact same rigid, formal shape regardless of the woman wearing it. Formal black velvet gowns that projected discipline, piety and control rather than radiant painted youth. Part of this came from religious conviction, a deeply Catholic court determined to present itself as sober and devout at a moment when the rest of Europe was tearing itself apart over questions of faith. This was not a court chasing the same porcelain white glow Elizabeth spent decades perfecting. It was chasing something closer to solemn, untouchable dignity, wrapped in shadow instead of light. Here's a detail that connects these two very different worlds more directly than you might expect. When Elizabeth's own half-sister Mary took the English throne and married that exact same Philip of Spain, the entire English court briefly adopted this Spanish-style wholesale dark fabrics, structured gowns, sombre formality, replacing some of England's earlier brighter fashions almost overnight. Which means the very same court Elizabeth would eventually inherit and dramatically reinvent with colour symbolism and that infamous white-painted mask had spent the years immediately before her reign dressed almost entirely in imported Spanish restraint. She did not simply follow a single unified European beauty standard. In a real sense, she was reacting against the specific aesthetic her own predecessor had left behind, swinging the entire visual identity of the English crown, from sombre and Spanish to radiant, symbolic and unmistakably her own. Now for a truly different case entirely, one that has almost nothing to do with queens or courts at all. In Venice, the very city whose name became permanently attached to Elizabeth's signature poison, an entirely different class of women were also famous across Europe for their beauty, their fashion sense, and yes, their own liberal use of that same white lead paste. Venetian courtesans, educated independent women who built entire careers around companionship conversation and carefully cultivated personal appeal were widely regarded as some of the most stylish women on the continent, closely studied by fashion writers of the period, the same way modern magazines might study a runway show. A Venetian writer named Cesare Vecellio even published illustrated catalogues of local dress toward the end of the century, carefully documenting exactly how these women styled themselves, down to the towering, precariously tall platform, shoes some of them wore simply to stand out a little further above the crowd. Here is the truly fascinating contrast, though. For Elizabeth, this exact white mask functioned as concealment, a way to hide vulnerability, illness, and the passage of time from a nation that needed to believe in her permanence. For a Venetian courtesan, that same white face was closer to advertising. It was not hiding anything. It was the whole point, a bold public declaration of beauty and availability in a competitive, visible trade where being noticed was the entire business model. It is worth remembering, too, that this particular path, glamorous as it looked from the outside, was also one of the very few routes available to a woman in that century who wanted any real independence over her own income and her own choices at all. The freedom on display came with its own set of very real limits, just as Elizabeth's crown came with limits of its own. Same paste, same poison quietly working underneath both of their skin in exactly the same biological way. Completely different reasons for putting it on in the first place. Can I ask you something here? Does it change how you think about any of this learning that the identical substance served two such completely opposite social purposes at the exact same moment in history, for a queen hiding and a courtesan advertising using the very same jar? There is one more comparison I've been holding on to since fairly early in this story, and I think now is finally the right moment to bring her back properly. Remember, Mary Queen of Scots, the cousin we mentioned briefly all the way back near the beginning, the one who grew up glamorous and adored at the French court, while Elizabeth was still fighting simply to survive her own childhood. Mary never really needed Elizabeth's particular brand of careful manufactured mythology. She had natural charm, real romantic drama, and an effortless kind of beauty that contemporary observers wrote about constantly, without needing a single approved court painter to manage the story for her. And it did not save her, not even a little. Mary's reign in Scotland collapsed under the weight of disastrous marriages, open scandal and a rebellion that eventually forced her to flee her own kingdom entirely. Her second husband was found dead after an explosion at his lodgings. Her third marriage followed almost immediately afterward to the man widely blamed for that very explosion, and by 1568, barely into her 20s, she had lost her throne, her army and most of her allies all at once crossing the border into England to beg her cousin for protection instead. She spent nearly 2 decades as Elizabeth's prisoner in England afterward, a constant living reminder of exactly the kind of chaos an unmanaged, unguarded royal reputation could invite. In 1587, Elizabeth finally signed the order for her cousin's execution ending, with a single stroke of a pen, the story of the one European queen of her generation who had never needed to build a painted mask because she had simply never learned. The way Elizabeth had learned so painfully early in her own life, exactly how dangerous the world could be for a woman with a crown and no armour. Sit with that contrast for a moment, because I think it says something quietly brutal about the entire subject of this story. Elizabeth's mask was destroying her, slowly, silently, one toxic layer at a time. But it also, in its own strange backwards way, appears to have worked. She survived on that throne for 44 years, longer than almost any monarch of her century managed anywhere on the continent. Her cousin, blessed with beauty that needed no chemical assistance at all, lost her own throne, her freedom, and eventually her life. I'm not sure that is a fair trade in any moral sense. A woman should not need to poison herself slowly, just to stay safe on a throne that was rightfully hers to begin with. But history rarely grades survival on fairness, and it almost never hands out credit in proportion to how much any given choice actually cost the person making it. So here is where all of these comparisons leave us. Elizabeth was never alone in facing this particular pressure. Other queens managed it with perfume and rumour, others managed it with fabric and restraint. Others turned it into an open, honest business transaction instead of a secret. And one tragically barely managed it at all. Elizabeth's own path, choosing the most extreme, most toxic version of concealment available to her, and turning it into a 4-decade-long performance of permanence, was a decision, not an inevitability. She had other options sitting right there across the English Channel, safer whitening powders, darker, more modest fashion that asked for restraint rather than radiance, an entirely different relationship with her own visibility altogether. She looked at all of that and chose the most extreme version of the mask anyway, and for a long time it worked exactly the way she needed it to. Why that particular choice out of every option available to her is worth sitting with for one more moment before we move on. An unmarried queen with no husband to legitimize her rule, no heir to guarantee stability after her, and a recent painful memory of exactly how quickly rumour and appearance could turn a crown into a death sentence, was never simply choosing a cosmetic. She was choosing the version of control that felt to her specifically the most bulletproof. Radiance as armour. Youth as a kind of permanent visible proof that nothing needed to change and nobody needed to worry. But no mask, no matter how carefully built, holds together forever. And the years still ahead of us in this story are about to show exactly what 4 decades of that particular choice had quietly been doing to the woman wearing it. Long after the paint had dried, the portraits had been approved, and every other queen in this comparison had already met her own very different ending. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being the only person in a room who knows the truth, while everyone else politely agrees to believe the version you have built for them instead. By the final decade of her reign, that was more or less the exact position Elizabeth found herself living inside every single day. We have already talked about the official version of her, the eternal, painted, impossibly young Elizabeth, that portraits and poetry kept circulating right up until her death. Now let's talk about the woman underneath that version, the one almost nobody outside a very small circle ever actually got to see. In December of 1597, a French diplomat named André Hurault de Metz finally secured the audience with Elizabeth he had been quietly requesting for weeks. He came to England on official business negotiating peace terms on behalf of the French king, and being a careful, observant man, he kept a detailed personal journal of what he witnessed at court. That journal survived, and it gives us something almost nothing else from this period gives us. An honest, unusually candid description of the actual queen written by somebody with no reason to flatter her for a painting or protect her for a portrait commission. He guessed her age at around 60. She was actually closer to 64. His description of her face is almost jarringly plain, especially set against everything we have spent this entire story learning about her carefully managed public image. He described her face as long, thin, and clearly aged. Her teeth, he noted, had turned yellow and grown uneven, several missing entirely enough that he sometimes struggled to understand her whenever she spoke quickly. And yet in the very same passage he also described her as tall, graceful and dignified in absolutely everything she did, a woman who carried herself with a kind of natural majesty that no amount of visible aging seemed able to fully erase. What struck him just as much as her face, though, was what she chose to wear. He described a gown of silver cloth/sleeves lined in red, worn open enough at the front that her chest remained visible throughout their entire audience, a striking, almost defiantly youthful styling choice for a woman deep into her 60s, at a court where fashion for a queen her age might reasonably have leaned towards something more modest and restrained. It is a small detail easy to skip past, but I think it says something meaningful about where her priorities still sat even this late in her reign. The face might be aging in ways the mask could only partly disguise. The presentation around it was still going to insist as loudly as fabric and styling could manage that nothing about her had actually changed at all. Here's a small detail from that same journal that I find almost unbearably human and honestly a little bit funny too. De Metz noted that whenever anyone brought up the subject of her looks, Elizabeth would immediately insist that she had never actually been beautiful in the first place. And then, according to his own observation, she would go right on talking about her own beauty anyway, at every available opportunity as often as she possibly could, which is, if you think about it, a remarkably relatable kind of contradiction for a woman who had spent 40 years being told her entire political survival depended on exactly how she looked. I do not think the contradiction makes her vain exactly, or at least not only vain. I think it makes her exhausted in a very particular, very specific way. Imagine spending 4 decades being told by ambassadors, by suitors, by portrait painters, by her own council, that your face was a matter of national security. At some point denying your own beauty out loud and quietly, seeking reassurance about it in the very same breath, probably stops being a contradiction at all. It becomes closer to a reflex worn smooth by repetition, the way any of us might brush off a compliment we have secretly been hoping somebody would give us anyway. Underneath the gowns and the jewels, her natural hair had thinned dramatically by this point in her life. The same striking red that had once been the envy of half the court, fading and falling away far faster than any wig maker could keep pace with gracefully. Elizabeth compensated the same way she compensated for almost everything else, with more layers applied, more carefully hidden, more completely. An entire collection of elaborate wigs dyed to match that same famous copper red using dye recipes that once again quietly relied on mercury to hold their colour, meaning even the hair covering her hidden baldness was contributing its own small, steady dose of poison to a body already struggling under everything else we have covered in this story. Ladies of her privy chamber were responsible for maintaining and styling this growing collection, curling and dressing each piece before every important appearance. One more quiet, unglamorous job performed by women whose own names rarely made it into any official record of the reign they helped keep looking flawless. But wigs and careful lighting can only hide so much for so long, and in September of 1599 that entire careful arrangement nearly came apart in a single, unplanned, deeply embarrassing morning. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, one of Elizabeth's favourite courtiers, and by most accounts someone she had genuine personal affection for, had just returned from a disastrous military campaign in Ireland, one he'd abandoned without her permission after months of frustration and failure. Desperate to reach her before his enemies at court could poison her opinion of him. First, Essex rode straight for the palace, arriving still splattered with the mud of his journey, and pushed past the usual layers of servants and ceremony that would normally have slowed any other courtier to a respectful crawl. He kept moving through the presence chamber, through the privy chamber, all the way to the door of the Queen's own bedchamber, and walked directly inside, completely unannounced. What he found waiting for him was not the rainbow portrait. It was not the Ditchley portrait standing serenely above a map of England, while storm clouds parted behind her. It was simply Elizabeth newly out of bed, without her wig, without a single layer of that carefully built mask, her thinning natural hair loose around her face, exactly the way 66 years of living and roughly 4 decades of toxic cosmetics had actually left it. Can you imagine standing in that doorway, not as the Earl desperate and travel-worn, but as the Queen herself caught in the one moment she had spent her entire adult life trying to prevent anyone from ever witnessing? According to accounts that circulated afterward among people at court, Essex was reportedly shaken enough by what he saw that he later made an unwise, indiscreet joke to friends about her appearance, a comment that eventually made its way back to Elizabeth herself, as these things nearly always do in a palace full of people who love repeating gossip. Whether that particular remark alone explains everything that happened between them afterward is honestly difficult to say with certainty. Their relationship was already strained by his failures in Ireland and his defiance of her direct orders, but something between them noticeably shifted after that morning, and within roughly a year and a half Essex would be arrested, tried and executed for leading an outright rebellion against her rule. I am not telling you that one embarrassing morning alone destroyed a man. His own choices did that far more directly than any bruised royal ego ever could. But it is hard not to notice the timing, and harder still not to wonder how much that single unguarded glimpse of the real woman beneath the myth quietly reshaped how she saw him afterward. Being seen without the mask for Elizabeth was never simply an embarrassment. It was closer to a small private catastrophe. Courtiers who spent time around her in these final years noticed other changes, too quieter ones than a single dramatic morning could capture. Longer silences during council meetings, a shorter temper with advisers who had served her loyally for decades, occasional unexplained stretches of melancholy that her ladies learned to work carefully around rather than question directly. None of this made it into any official portrait, obviously, and very little of it made it into any letter bold enough to describe a reigning queen as anything less than triumphant. But the people closest to her, the same small circle trusted with her actual face every morning, were also increasingly the people trusted with her actual mood, and by most surviving accounts that mood had grown considerably heavier than the paintings ever let on. And yet remarkably she kept working. Council meetings continued. Foreign ambassadors kept being received dressed, painted and dazzled exactly the way they always had been. Parliament still heard from her directly. Whatever was happening underneath the wig and the paint and the increasingly heavy jewellery it did not stop her from doing the actual job of ruling a kingdom right up until the final months of her life. If nothing else, that particular fact deserves real respect, regardless of how you feel about everything else in this story. Whatever this mask cost her privately, it never once stopped her from showing up. There is another detail from these same final years that gets repeated constantly across popular retellings of her life, though I want to be honest about exactly how solid the evidence behind it actually is. According to a persistent, widely shared account, Elizabeth eventually refused to allow a single mirror anywhere in her private rooms, during her later years unable or simply unwilling to look directly at what the mask was hiding underneath. It is one of those stories that shows up again and again in books and documentaries about her repeated so often it has taken on the weight of settled fact. The honest answer is that we cannot point to one single ironclad historical document proving it happened exactly that way. What we can say with real confidence is that the psychological portrait behind that story lines up almost perfectly with everything else we know for certain about her. A woman who controlled which portraits were allowed to exist. A woman who was mortified enough by one unguarded morning to potentially reshape a major political relationship afterward. Whether or not the specific detail about mirrors is literally precisely true, the fear it describes almost certainly was. Sometimes a story survives for centuries not because every detail checks out perfectly, but because it captures something true about a person that the verified facts alone never quite managed to say out loud. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, and I think it applies just as easily to plenty of us as it does to her. How much of your own energy on an average day goes toward managing how you appear to other people, rather than simply existing as you actually are? Most of us will never face anything near Elizabeth's specific stakes. But the underlying instinct, the quiet, constant labour of managing a gap between the truth and the version other people are allowed to see is not nearly as foreign to most of us as we might like to believe. If there is a mistake worth correcting before we move any further into this story, it is this. It would be easy to assume everything we just walked through was simply a continuation of the political propaganda we already spent real time unpacking earlier. The portraits, the poetry, the carefully managed public mythology of an eternal queen. But this is a truly different layer of the same problem. That earlier campaign was about controlling what the kingdom believed. This is about what it apparently cost her personally, privately, every single morning to keep living underneath a myth that even her own most trusted courtiers now quietly expected to be true, whether or not the woman underneath it had any energy left to keep performing it. There is a meaningful difference between a government managing a narrative and a single exhausted human being trying to physically embody that narrative every waking hour of her life. The council could approve or destroy as many paintings as it wanted. It could not, though, make Elizabeth's teeth stop falling out or her hair stop thinning, or her own body stop quietly registering 4 decades of chronic poisoning in ways no amount of official denial could actually undo. The propaganda was a story other people told about her. This part of the story is about the woman who still had to wake up underneath it every single morning, and somehow make the story true for one more day. By the turn of the century, Elizabeth was managing 3 things simultaneously that would exhaust almost anyone alive today. A body slowly breaking down from 4 decades of accumulated poison. A political mythology that demanded she never visibly age, get sick, or falter in public. And a small, shrinking circle of people who actually knew the difference between the woman and the myth, most of whom she trusted with her literal survival. Every single morning they helped her get dressed. Think back for a moment to the frightened, brilliant young woman we met all the way at the start of this story, learning under real threat of execution that control over her own image was the only weapon she truly had. 4 decades later, that same weapon had become its own kind of prison, one she had built herself one layer at a time, with her own careful, deliberate hands. That balance, precarious for years, was not going to hold forever. And the final winter of her reign, the one we are heading toward next in this story, would finally show exactly what happens when a woman who has spent 40 years refusing to let the world see her weaken finally runs out a road to keep running on. Every long performance eventually reaches its final act, whether the performer is ready for it or not. For Elizabeth, that final act began quietly, almost gently, with nothing more dramatic than a piece of bad news, arriving at court on an ordinary February morning, the kind of morning that gives absolutely no warning about what it is quietly setting into motion. In February of 1603, word reached the Queen that Catherine, Countess of Nottingham, had died. This was not simply another courtier passing away somewhere in the background of a long reign. Catherine had served in Elizabeth's household for roughly 45 years, nearly the entire length of the reign itself, and some at court quietly believed the two women shared an even closer bond than anyone officially acknowledged, since Catherine's own mother had been the sister of Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. Whatever the exact nature of that connection, the loss hit Elizabeth hard. She stopped sleeping properly. She stopped eating with any real appetite. People around her began describing a restlessness that looked less like ordinary grief and more like something settling in for the long term. Grief on its own rarely kills anyone directly, but grief arriving at the exact moment a body has almost nothing left in reserve to fight back with is an entirely different, far more dangerous kind of visitor. Elizabeth had already spent decades absorbing quiet, accumulating damage from the very mask that made her recognizable to an entire kingdom. Losing one of the last people who had known her since the earliest, most uncertain years of her reign seems to have removed whatever remaining will she had left to keep pushing through it. She moved to Richmond Palace not long afterward, the same palace where her grandfather had died almost a century earlier, and where she herself had first fallen dangerously ill with smallpox all the way back at the beginning of this story. There is something almost unbearably fitting about that detail if you think about it. The place tied to her first brush with death would also become the place tied to her last. Even here, though, in a body clearly beginning to fail her, her personality had not gone anywhere. A Venetian ambassador visiting around this time brought up the touchy subject of English piracy against Venetian shipping, and Elizabeth, apparently unbothered by whatever illness was quietly working through her system, sharply reminded him that his republic only ever seemed to show up when it wanted something. When the exchange grew a little pointed, she reportedly asked him half seriously whether her own sex was somehow to blame for how he was treating her. It is a small moment easy to miss, but I love it precisely because it proves something important. Whatever was happening underneath the surface, the sharp, quick, occasionally sarcastic woman who had spent 45 years running an entire kingdom was still very much present right up until nearly the end. Her body, though, was telling an increasingly different story than her wit was. Her once slender hands had swollen considerably enough that a ring she had worn continuously since the day of her coronation 45 years earlier, without ever once removing it, had grown into her own flesh. Doctors eventually had to file it off her finger entirely because it could no longer be slipped over the knuckle by any gentler method. That ring was not simply jewellery. It symbolised her lifelong unbroken marriage to the kingdom itself, the exact metaphor she had chosen decades earlier instead of a husband. Watching it forcibly cut away from her body struck the people around her as something akin to a formal physical omen. If the ring representing her marriage to England could finally be broken, What did that suggest about how much longer the marriage itself actually had left? Around the same time, on the anniversary of a date, she almost certainly did not need reminding of the execution of the Earl of Essex. Elizabeth withdrew into her private chambers for several days. When she finally reappeared, those near her described her as melancholy and disoriented rambling, in a way sharp enough to worry even her most trusted adviser William Cecil's son Robert, who reportedly feared some kind of strange affliction had settled directly into her mind. Then came the throat. Contemporary accounts describe a painful swelling developing somewhere in her throat, what one ambassador's report from the time called a defluxion, an old medical term roughly describing a build-up of fluid or infection settling in one place. It grew severe enough at one point that it nearly choked her entirely, before briefly temporarily clearing on its own around the middle of March. Modern doctors looking back at this specific detail have suggested it sounds consistent with a serious bacterial throat infection, something like quinsy, a complication of tonsillitis capable of swelling the throat almost completely shut. Without antibiotics, which nobody in 16th century England had any access to, an infection like that could realistically threaten the life of even an otherwise healthy person, let alone a woman already in her late 60s carrying 4 decades of accumulated damage inside her. She refused to go to bed. For days, then longer, she insisted on staying upright, sitting instead on cushions arranged directly on the floor of her own bedchamber, her gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance for hours at a stretch, one finger pressed against her mouth as though something inside it was still quietly troubling her. She refused food. She refused her own doctor's permission to examine her properly. Whatever instinct had driven her for her entire life to control precisely what the world was allowed to see of her seemed to be making one final exhausted appearance applied now, not to portraits or public appearances, but to the plain, unglamorous mechanics of simply staying alive. On a Saturday in the middle of March, a young courtier named Robert Carey, a distant cousin through her mother's side of the family, came to see her. According to his own later account, she took his hand, looked at him, and said only this: "Robin, I am not well." 4 words spoken by a woman who'd spent an entire lifetime insisting publicly and repeatedly on exactly the opposite. I want to sit with that moment for a second, because I think it might be the single most human line in this entire story. Not a Latin motto stitched into a portrait, not a carefully worded speech delivered to Parliament about princes standing on a stage for all the world to observe. 4 plain words admitted quietly to a relative once there was finally nobody left in the room who needed convincing otherwise. 45 years of ruling an entire kingdom, and in the end the truest thing she ever said out loud might have been the simplest one. Can I ask you something here? After everything we have walked through together in this story, 4 decades of paint propaganda and carefully guarded appearances, does that one small, honest sentence hit you differently than anything else we have covered so far? It certainly does for me. There is something almost startling about watching a woman built entirely out of managed images finally say something with absolutely no management in it at all. Eventually, after considerable persuasion from those closest to her, Elizabeth allowed herself to be moved into her actual bed on the 22nd of March. Her council increasingly anxious about the unresolved question of who would take the throne after her finally pressed the matter directly. Since her throat had swollen too badly by this point for her to speak clearly, they reportedly asked her to signal her wishes about the succession, using nothing more than a gesture. Exactly what happened next depends entirely on which account you choose to trust. Some witnesses later claimed she raised her hand toward her own head, tracing something like the shape of a crown, a silent nod toward her cousin's son James of Scotland. Others insisted she made no clear gesture at all, and that the entire interpretation was decided afterward by counsellors who badly needed an answer and were willing to interpret one into whatever movement they could find. Either way, it was James who would be reported from that room onward as the Queen's chosen successor. On the evening of the 23rd of March, only her closest attendants remained with her, along with the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man named John Whitgift, who stayed by her bedside praying. She held his hand throughout, calm rather than frightened by every surviving account we have. Through the night she drifted in and out of consciousness, the room quiet except for prayer and the sound of her own breathing, slower now and more laboured than it had been even a day before. Somewhere between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning on the 24th of March 1603 Elizabeth died. One account from the period written not long afterward described her passing with a phrase I find quietly beautiful, considering everything that came before it. She departed from this life mildly like a lamb. A different, far more dramatic line has also attached itself to her death. Over the centuries, supposedly her actual final words. All my possessions for one moment of time. It is a haunting sentence, and it would fit beautifully into this particular story. A woman who spent her entire life trading her body and her image for political survival, finally admitting that none of it was worth a single extra minute at the very end. Most serious historians, though, consider that specific line almost certainly invented later, added well after the fact by someone who understood exactly how good it would sound. I mention it anyway because I think it is worth knowing the difference between the story we wish were true and the far quieter, far more ordinary reality of an exhausted woman slipping in and out of consciousness in a dim room surrounded by prayer. And here is where this story finally fully closes the loop it opened with all the way back at the very beginning. Because according to reports from those who prepared her body afterward, Elizabeth died with roughly a full inch of white lead-based paint still layered across her face. The exact same mask we started this entire journey with, born out of fear in a quiet room after a childhood illness, ended it too still sitting on her skin at the precise moment her heart finally stopped. Her own attendants refused to allow any formal examination of her body afterward, protecting even in death the same privacy she had guarded so fiercely in life. Which means we will never have a clean clinical answer for exactly what killed her. Modern historians and pathologists who have studied the surviving accounts tend to point toward a serious lung infection, possibly worsened by her declining mental state and her refusal to eat, rest, or accept treatment in her final weeks. Others still argue that decades of chronic lead exposure had already quietly weakened her body, long before that final illness ever arrived, leaving her with far less strength to fight it off than a woman her age might otherwise have had. A smaller number point toward that throat abscess alone arguing a severe enough infection could have overwhelmed her on its own with or without decades of poison sitting quietly in her bones. We touched on this exact tension earlier in this story, and it applies here with even more weight. The precise single cause will probably never be settled with certainty. What we can say is that both explanations, the sudden illness and the slow accumulated poison, likely work together rather than separately, one weakening the door, the other finally walking through it. A body that had spent 4 decades quietly absorbing lead, mercury and belladonna was never going to fight off a serious infection the same way a healthy body might have. The mask did not need to kill her directly on its own in order to have played a genuine part in her death. It simply needed to leave her a little weaker, a little slower to recover at exactly the moment her body needed every ounce of strength it could still find. Her funeral, held roughly a month later, on the 28th of April, was enormous, a long procession winding through London watched by what witnesses described as an overwhelming crowd, many openly weeping in the street, some reportedly climbing onto rooftops and window ledges simply to catch a glimpse of the coffin passing below. An effigy of her dressed in full royal regalia sat above her coffin, crafted so convincingly lifelike that mourners reportedly gasped when they first caught sight of it, one final uncanny echo of the exact same instinct that had shaped her entire reign. Even in death the image had to be managed. Even in death the mask went first, riding above the actual coffin, while the real damaged body it represented travelled underneath, hidden from view one very last time. She was the last of the Tudors. 45 years on the throne, ending in a quiet bedroom with a handful of exhausted attendants, one praying archbishop and a face still covered in the same poison that had followed her since she was 29 years old. Outside that bedroom church, bells across London had already begun ringing before most of the city even fully understood why. Within hours, criers were reading a formal proclamation in the streets, announcing that a king from Scotland now sat on the English throne, and that a dynasty stretching back more than a century had quietly and finally come to its end. But her death was never going to be the end of this particular story. Not really. Because the moment she stopped breathing, an entirely new set of questions opened up about her body, about her legacy, and about just how far this exact same dangerous obsession with a painted permanent youth would travel forward through the centuries that followed her, long after the last of the Tudors had been carried through the streets of London and laid quietly to rest. A queen does not simply stop existing the moment her heart stops beating. If anything, this is usually the exact point where the more complicated, more interesting part of her story actually begins. Elizabeth's body was embalmed shortly after her death, and kept lying in state at Whitehall Palace for roughly 3 weeks before that enormous funeral procession we already talked about made its way through London. Embalming at that time was a rough, imperfect science at best, mostly involving spices wrapping and a great deal of hope, so keeping any royal body presentable for that long required real effort from the people responsible for it. Her coffin was placed at first inside the same vault holding her grandfather Henry VII. It stayed there for a few years until James, the new king who had inherited her throne, ordered it moved into its own dedicated chapel within Westminster Abbey in 1606, resting beneath a monument built specifically in her honour. Even the choice of where to finally put her body carried a quiet political message. The new dynasty wanted her remembered as a settled, honoured piece of history safely finished, rather than as a living rival anyone still needed to worry about. James himself, ruling now as King of both England and Scotland at once, for the first time in either country's history inherited a kingdom that had spent 45 years organised entirely around one woman's careful, deliberate performance of permanence. He'd grown up hearing about her from a distance his entire life, a distant cousin, an eventual rival his own mother, Mary Queen of Scots, had lost everything to. Now, rather suddenly, he was expected to fill a throne that an entire nation had spent decades being told would somehow impossibly never actually need filling at all. Almost immediately, people began doing something rather strange with the queen they had just lost. They started missing her. Here is the part I find almost impossible not to find a little funny in a dark sort of way, given everything we just spent 2 entire chapters walking through together. Within only a handful of years, as James's own reign ran into its own share of financial troubles, religious tension, and political missteps, English memory did something history does constantly and almost never fairly. It began smoothing Elizabeth's actual complicated, physically declining final years into something considerably shinier than the woman we just watched struggle through a swollen throat and a filed-off wedding ring. People started calling her reign a golden age. Merchants and playwrights leaned into her memory as a symbol of stability and national pride. Nostalgia, it turns out, has never needed accurate information to spread. It only needs a present bad enough to make the past look better by comparison. And the early years of the new Stuart dynasty gave people plenty of reason to start looking backward fondly. The exhausted, grieving, physically ravaged woman who told her young cousin Robin that she was not well got quietly replaced in the popular imagination by something considerably closer to a legend. Again, almost the very same week, the real woman had finally been laid to rest. Everything we spent 2 entire chapters carefully uncovering: the swollen throat, the filed ring, the honest confession to a relative, the actual mechanics of a human body finally giving out, got folded right back into the very same myth that had been protecting her for the final 40 years of her life. Death apparently was not enough to stop the machine. If anything, it simply removed the one person who might have eventually grown tired of running it. Doesn't that strike you as a little unsettling? We just spent real time in this story trying to recover the actual human Elizabeth from underneath her own carefully constructed myth. And almost immediately after her death, an entire nation went right back to rebuilding that same myth all over again, apparently without even needing her cooperation this time. But here is where the story takes a turn I honestly did not expect when I first started researching this particular chapter, and I think it might be the single most surprising thing we've covered in this entire journey together. The specific image most of us actually picture when we hear the words Elizabeth I, that ghostly thick, almost clownish white mask smeared across her face, the version played by actresses like Margot Robbie or Cate Blanchett in modern films, did not actually take shape the way most people assume. For roughly 2 centuries after her death, artists and writers mostly continued depicting her, the exact same way her own court had insisted on depicting her while she was alive. Ageless, radiant, untouched by time. A painting from the early 1800s showing the Earl of Essex bursting into her private chamber, the very scene we walk through together earlier in this story, still portrays her as a smooth, youthful, almost otherworldly figure more than 200 years after her actual death, and more than 200 years after her real aging face had already been thoroughly documented by eyewitnesses like the French ambassador we spent time with. The dramatic ghost, white, slightly horrifying version of Elizabeth that dominates our modern imagination appears to have taken proper shape considerably later than that, largely during the Victorian era, well over 200 years after she actually died. 19th century writers and artists working in a period fascinated by Gothic imagery, tragic heroines, and the eerie side of history seem to have been the ones who really leaned into the image of a decaying painted queen hiding behind a mask of makeup, reshaping her story into something considerably closer to a ghost story than a straightforward biography. This was, after all, the same century that gave the world haunted mansions, doomed romantic heroines, and an entire literary appetite for beautiful women hiding some dreadful secret beneath a lovely surface. Elizabeth, with her genuine documented use of white lead and her genuine documented final years of decline, fit that particular cultural mood almost too perfectly to resist. Sit with that for a second, because I think it completely reframes everything we have spent this entire series building together. The toxic, tragic, painted queen most of us picture is not simply a historical fact passed down cleanly from the 16th century. She's also in her own way a 19th century invention shaped by writers who never met her, working nearly 300 years after she actually lived, reaching for a version of her story that fit their own era's particular taste for the macabre. And then more recently still, 20th and 21st century filmmakers picked up that exact same Victorian version and ran with it even further, giving us the clown-faced, tragic, crumbling queen so many of us now assume is simply obviously historically true. None of this means the underlying facts we have spent this entire series building are wrong. The lead was real. The mercury was real. The decline, the swollen throat, the filed ring, all of it happened exactly the way we have described it. What changed over time was not the facts themselves, but the intensity, the visual drama, the sheer theatrical weight placed on top of those facts by generations of storytellers who never once had to sit in a room with the actual woman. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If the version of Elizabeth living in most of our heads right now is actually a layered composite built by her own court, then reshaped by Victorian Gothic imagination, then reshaped again by modern film, how much of what we think we know about anyone from history is really just that same process happening quietly, generation after generation, without any of us ever really noticing it happen? Whatever the exact proportions of fact and later embellishment, one thing about this story remained stubbornly dangerously real for centuries after Elizabeth's death. The actual poison did not go anywhere. More than 150 years after Elizabeth died, a young woman named Maria Gunning, the Countess of Coventry, became one of the most talked about beauties in all of London society, famous enough to need a personal guard just to walk safely through a public park. Born into a proud but truly struggling Irish family, she and her equally striking sister had arrived in London with looks alone as their real inheritance, quickly becoming the kind of celebrities entire newspapers wrote about simply for showing up somewhere in public. She wore the exact same basic cosmetic Elizabeth had relied on centuries earlier, white lead mixed with vinegar applied thickly across her face in pursuit of that same pale, fashionable glow that had never really gone out of style across all those generations in between. By her late 20s, her skin had begun breaking out and deteriorating, and following the exact same tragic pattern we already spent real time unpacking earlier in this story, she responded by applying even more of the very substance almost certainly causing the damage in the first place. According to several accounts from the period, she eventually retreated into a darkened bedroom, during her final weeks refusing visitors, entirely unwilling to let anyone see what her once celebrated face had actually become. She died in 1760 at only 27 years old, leaving behind 3 young children and a husband already known for straying elsewhere. For a long time, popular history simply labelled her death a straightforward case of vanity, a cautionary tale about a foolish young woman poisoned by her own cosmetics. It became something akin to a moral fable, repeated in books and articles for generations afterward, the beautiful woman undone by her own beauty regimen. More recent historians looking closely at the actual medical evidence have pushed back on that tidy version, pointing out that she also showed clear signs of a serious lung illness, likely tuberculosis, a disease that was quietly devastating families across Europe, regardless of how much makeup anyone in that family happened to wear. The honest conclusion is probably a combination of both factors working together, rather than one single clean villain, the same layered, complicated truth we kept running into throughout Elizabeth's own story as well. Does that particular pattern of uncertainty sound at all familiar by this point? A famous woman's death later flattened into one simple, satisfying explanation, when the actual medical reality was almost certainly far messier and far less convenient for storytelling than the popular version admits. History seems to truly prefer clean morals over complicated truths, and beautiful famous women appear to pay the price for that preference, more often than almost anyone else in the historical record. We're not so far removed from this question as we might like to think either. A toxicologist working in Canada recently went as far as actually recreating several of these centuries-old white lead recipes in a modern laboratory, mixing the same basic ingredients in roughly the same proportions historical recipes called for specifically to measure how dangerous they truly were by today's scientific standards. That kind of research matters because it means this is not simply a closed, settled chapter of history we get to comfortably shake our heads at from a safe distance. People are still actively trying to understand exactly how much damage substances like these actually caused, using tools and knowledge nobody in Elizabeth's court or in Maria Gunning's London drawing rooms ever had the slightest access to. We spent an entire earlier chapter of this story walking through the biology of exactly how lead moves through a human body. It is worth remembering that the same questions we answered with modern science back then are still right now actively being tested and refined by people working in real laboratories today. Can I ask you something here? Knowing that scientists are still running experiments on this exact substance centuries after both Elizabeth and Maria Gunning died, does that change how distant this story actually feels to you? I know it changed something for me somewhere in the middle of researching all of this. This is not a closed case file gathering dust somewhere. It is still in its own quiet way an open one. If there is a mistake worth naming clearly before we wrap up this particular chapter, it is assuming any of this ended when the specific ingredient list eventually changed. Elizabeth's story is not really about one unlucky queen and one uniquely dangerous jar of paint sitting on one particular dressing table. It is about a pattern repeating itself across centuries in different countries, using different formulas chasing the exact same basic promise. Pale, flawless, permanent youth purchased at a price. Nobody selling the product ever bothered mentioning out loud, I think there is also something worth naming about who tends to get remembered this way in the first place. Powerful, famous women across centuries keep getting reduced to a single cautionary image after they die. The vain queen, the foolish beauty, the woman who simply should have known better. Rarely do we hear the same flattened, moralizing story told about a powerful man's private habits. That imbalance is not an accident of storytelling. It is a pattern, and once you start noticing it in Elizabeth's case and in Maria Gunning's case, it becomes very difficult to stop noticing it everywhere else too. And that pattern, as strange as this might sound, tucked inside a story about a 16th century queen, did not actually stop with lead, or with the 18th century, or with Maria Gunning's tragically short life either. The chemistry changed. The marketing changed. The specific poison hiding inside the jar changed more than once. But the underlying instinct we've been tracing this entire time, the belief that looking a certain way is worth almost any risk, worth almost any cost, quietly followed fashionable society forward generation after generation, all the way into an era you and I would actually recognize if we saw it. Wearing packaging far more convincing and promises far more polished than anything Elizabeth's ladies ever had available to them. Let's step all the way forward now out of Richmond Palace, out of Westminster Abbey, out of powdered wigs and Latin mottos stitched into portraits, and into a place that might feel a little too familiar for comfort, right here, tonight, wherever you happen to be listening to this from. Because here is the part of this story that I think deserves to sit with you the longest long after you've drifted off. This never actually ended. Think back for a moment to the very same white lead we spent so much of this story with. Long after Elizabeth's own death, that exact substance was formally classified as a poison in Europe in the 1630s, roughly 3 decades after she had already died still wearing it. And even with that formal classification sitting on the books, official documented impossible to plead ignorance about women across Europe kept applying it to their faces for another 2 full centuries afterward. Knowing something is dangerous and actually stopping its use, it turns out have almost never travelled together at the same speed in any era of human history we have access to. In the United States, mercury has technically been banned from most cosmetics since 1973. That is over 50 years of clear formal government-approved knowledge that this exact substance does not belong anywhere near human skin, And yet earlier this year, the Attorney General of New York ordered several companies to stop selling skin lightening creams containing mercury at levels reported to be tens of thousands of times higher than the legal limit. Not double, not 10 times, tens of thousands of times over. Independent researchers testing similar products purchased from major online retailers have found the exact same pattern again and again, year after year, in country after country. A recent scientific survey testing dozens of skin-lightening products purchased across several countries in Asia found that well over half of them exceeded international mercury limits, some by an almost unbelievable margin, thousands of times beyond what any health authority considers even remotely acceptable. The specific jar has changed. The specific century has changed. The core transaction, quiet, private healthy skin traded for a promise of paler, smoother, more socially rewarded skin has not changed nearly as much as any of us might like to believe. Global demand for skin lightening products alone was estimated at nearly $9 billion just a few years ago, with projections showing that number continuing to climb. Billions of dollars spent every single year chasing a version of the exact same idea. Elizabeth's court was already chasing 400 and some years ago. Pale skin as proof of comfort, status and belonging. We just spent an entire story watching where this particular idea led one specific woman. It clearly never stopped travelling after her. Here's something worth sitting with honestly, because I think it matters. Modern products like these are not for the most part being marketed to wealthy European queens anymore. Reporting on this exact issue has repeatedly found these creams marketed heavily toward communities of colour, playing directly into a beauty standard that treats lighter skin as inherently more desirable, more successful, more acceptable. That is not a coincidence, and it is not new either. It is the exact same engine that powered Elizabeth's own court 4 centuries ago, repackaged, rebranded and aimed at an entirely different, much larger group of people who never got a vote in deciding that pale skin should mean anything at all. I think it is worth asking honestly why regulation keeps lagging so far behind the damage in the first place. Part of the answer is depressingly simple. The main law covering cosmetic safety in the United States has not been meaningfully rewritten since 1938. Nearly 90 years. An entire industry selling products applied directly to human skin every single day, operating for the better part of a century under rules written before most of the chemistry we now understand even existed. Individual states have started stepping in where the federal government has not banning specific dangerous ingredients on their own, one law at a time, filling gaps that arguably should never have existed in the first place. California passed its own broad restrictions on toxic ingredients in personal care products only a few years ago. New York followed shortly afterward, with a law specifically targeting mercury in cosmetics. Both of those laws exist precisely because the older, larger national framework simply was not keeping pace with what was already sitting on store shelves and shipping through the mail. There is something almost darkly funny about that gap if you allow yourself to laugh at it for just a second. An industry built entirely around convincing people their appearance needs constant attention and improvement has for the better part of a century received considerably less regulatory attention itself than the food sitting next to it on the very same shelf. Does that sound familiar by any chance? A known danger? A slow, uneven patchwork response. Determined sellers finding new ways around whatever rules eventually do get written. We watched almost this exact same pattern play out across 4 centuries in this story already. Ancient writers warning about the very same metal Elizabeth eventually wore on her face. physicians in her own era quietly recommending safer alternatives that plenty of fashionable people ignored anyway. A poison formally classified as such more than 3 decades after her own death, and still sold openly for another 200 years after that classification. History does not really repeat itself in the tidy poetic way people sometimes claim. It just keeps running the exact same experiment on different subjects wearing different labels, waiting to see if anyone finally decides the results are worth acting on sooner this time. So let me ask you something gently before we wrap up this particular chapter of history together. What is it really that keeps pulling human beings back toward the same basic trade, again and again, across so many centuries and so many completely different cultures? I do not think the honest answer is vanity, at least not in the shallow, dismissive way that word usually gets used. I think the honest answer is fear dressed up as beauty most of the time. Fear of being judged, fear of being replaced, fear of losing whatever fragile foothold of safety or status a person has managed to build for themselves. In a world that has never been especially kind to people, it decides do not look the way they are supposed to look. We spend so much energy across so many centuries mocking the specific choices people made to manage that fear. The lead, the mercury, the belladonna, the modern cream sitting quietly in a bathroom cabinet somewhere tonight, without spending nearly enough energy asking why the fear itself keeps getting handed down so faithfully. Generation after generation, almost never questioned at its actual source. It is always easier to laugh at the jar than to interrogate the world that made the jar feel necessary in the first place. Elizabeth was not choosing lead because she thought it made her prettier in some simple shallow sense. She was choosing it because an entire kingdom had convinced her from childhood onward that her survival and her worth were tied directly to how she appeared to strangers she would never actually meet. Maria Gunning was not choosing it because she loved the smell of vinegar and metal on her own skin. She was choosing it because an entire society had convinced her that her value expired the moment her looks did. And somewhere tonight in a country you may or may not have ever visited, a woman is very possibly opening a jar of cream that promises to lighten her skin for reasons that have far less to do with vanity than with a lifetime of being taught quietly and constantly exactly what her own community will and will not reward her for. 3 women, 3 centuries apart in some cases, all 3 doing something that looks from a safe distance like the exact same small, quiet act of self-harm, and all 3 actually responding in their own time and their own place to a world that had already decided long before they ever opened that particular jar what parts of them were and were not acceptable. None of that makes the choice safe. It just means the choice rarely comes from nowhere, and it almost never comes from simple foolishness either. Think back for a second over everything we have walked through together tonight. A frightened young woman surviving a disease that nearly killed her, and deciding quietly in an empty room that she would never again let the world see her afraid. A substance born in ancient Rome, refined in Venice, and carried across an entire continent long before it ever touched her skin. A daily ritual involving lead mercury and a plant literally named for beauty while quietly poisoning the very people using it. A political machine that turned her damaged, aging face into an eternal painted myth, and a body that kept paying the real price underneath that myth for 4 decades straight. A death that closed the loop on the very first image we opened this story with, and a legacy that kept reshaping itself, generation after generation, long after she had any say in the matter at all. Every single piece of that story, when you step back far enough, is really the same story told once in fine, patient detail. A human being doing almost anything to feel safe in a world that made safety conditional on how she looked. If you take nothing else from tonight, I hope you at least take that one thread with you, since it turns out to run through almost everything else we've covered. If I can leave you with one honest thought before we say goodnight properly, it is this. Your own skin, exactly as it exists on you tonight, was never actually the problem in any of these stories. The problem was always a world that kept insisting it might be. Elizabeth spent 40 years and countless layers of poison trying to outrun a truth every single human being eventually has to sit with anyway. Bodies age. Bodies change. Bodies eventually stop, no matter how carefully anyone manages the mask sitting on top of them. She fought that truth as hard as any human being in recorded history ever has, with more resources, more power, and more control over her own image than almost anyone else of her era. And it still, in the end, simply came for her anyway, exactly the way it comes for everyone. There is something quietly comforting buried inside that if you let it be, if a woman with an entire kingdom's worth of wealth, power, and propaganda at her disposal could not outrun time, none of us ever really needed to feel like personal failures for being unable to outrun it either. Bodies changing is not evidence of anything going wrong. It is simply evidence of a life being lived. Next time you find yourself standing in front of a mirror noticing some small new line, some new patch of grey, some little detail that feels like it arrived overnight, I hope some quiet part of you remembers this exact story, remembers a queen with unlimited resources who tried harder than almost anyone in recorded history to stop that exact process, and remembers that even she in the end was simply a person living inside a body that was always going to keep moving forward whether she gave it permission or not. That is not a tragedy. It is just what it means to be a living thing in a body moving through time. Elizabeth spent 40 years treating that ordinary universal fact as an enemy to be defeated. I would rather you spend tonight treating it as something considerably gentler than that. So here is where we finally leave her. Not as a clown-faced myth, not as a Victorian ghost story, just as a frightened, brilliant, endlessly calculating young woman standing alone in a quiet room 400 years ago, looking at a small mirror by candlelight, deciding that the world would never again get to see her afraid. She kept that promise to herself for 40 years. It cost her more than she probably ever imagined it would back in that very first quiet room. And it also, in its own strange, complicated way, kept her safely on a throne longer than almost any monarch in her country's entire history. Both of those things are true at the exact same time, and I think that is precisely what makes her story worth telling honestly, rather than simply telling it as a cautionary tale with a tidy, comfortable ending. Thank you truly for spending this much time inside her story with me tonight. Stories like this take real care to put together properly, fact by fact, century by century, and having you here all the way to the end means more than you probably realize. If something in tonight's story stayed with you, the frightened girl by candlelight, the workers in Venice, nobody remembered the ambassador's honest description, the ring cut from a swollen finger, the 4 plain words spoken to a cousin, I would love to hear which part it was whenever you get a chance to share it. Those little moments of connection are honestly my favourite part of doing this at all. For now, let your eyes rest. Let the candle in your own mind burn a little lower, and let this particular story settle quietly into the back of your thoughts, the way all the best ones eventually do. Elizabeth is finally allowed to simply rest now too, mask and all no longer needing to perform permanence for anyone including us. There is another strange true story waiting for us soon from a different century, a different kingdom, and a different quiet room, somewhere in the past still waiting patiently to be opened up properly. I will see you there. Sleep well,